Arc raiders might look like just another extraction shooter on the surface, but buried inside its world is one of the most genuinely terrifying alien invasion stories in modern gaming. And today we are going through every piece of it, from the first moment the sky changed to what the machines are doing to Earth right now. I made this video because after spending a serious amount of time digging through Arc Raiders lore, I kept running into the same problem. The story is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It is hidden in item descriptions, in the design of the machines themselves, in the geography of the ruined world you move through every time you drop in. I decided to pull all of that together into one place. The specific choice I made when assembling this was to put Arc itself at the center. A lot of lore content focuses on human survivors, raider factions, corporate backstory. All of that comes up here. But the real question I wanted to answer is what Arc actually is, how powerful it actually is, and what it is genuinely doing on Earth. I also reordered some of the lore fragments, so they tell a cleaner story rather than jumping around the way the in-game material presents them. Some of what you are going to hear is interpretation. The game does not hand you a clean answer, but the pieces do fit together, and when they do, the picture they form is remarkable. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Day the Sky Changed. To understand how powerful Arc is, you have to start at the beginning, and the beginning is an event that nobody alive today in the world of Arc Raiders can fully describe with accuracy. The arrival is not a clean moment in the lore. It is more like a seam, a place where one version of the world ends and another begins without a clear border between them. Everything before the arrival is referred to in fragments, in half-remembered conversations, in the kind of language people use when they are talking about something so large and so violent that the brain refuses to process it as a single event. What the lore points toward is that the arrival was not a dramatic Hollywood moment where a ship appears and the world waits. It was chaotic, fast, and deeply confusing to everyone who experienced it. The machines did not announce themselves. One possible reading of the earliest lore fragments is that the first Arc units to reach Earth's surface were not the dramatic, towering combat constructs that you encounter in the game today. They were smaller, they were quieter, they were doing something before anyone realized they needed to be stopped. This matters because it shapes everything that came after. The humans who first encountered Arc did not understand what they were looking at. There was no context. There was no historical precedent. The institutions that might have coordinated a response were trying to figure out whether what they were seeing was real before they could even begin to think about how to respond to it. The scale of the initial arrival is one of the things the lore is most careful about. It suggests, through various item descriptions and world details, that the first wave was not the largest wave. The first wave was, in a sense, an assessment. The machines that came down first were gathering information, mapping the terrain, cataloguing resources, and establishing footholds before the full weight of the Arc presence made itself known. This is one of the details that makes Arc genuinely unsettling as an antagonist. The opening move was not force. The opening move was something closer to curiosity, or to what curiosity looks like when it has no emotions attached to it at all. By the time human governments understood that what was happening was an invasion, rather than some kind of unknown natural phenomenon or experimental weapon, significant time had already passed. The lore does not give you exact numbers. It points toward weeks rather than days, weeks during which Arc units were moving across the surface, entering abandoned structures, collecting materials, and building infrastructure that would later serve as the backbone of their occupation. Those early weeks are described in the lore as a window that closed before anyone managed to take it seriously. The cost of those lost weeks was enormous. The decision-making at the governmental and military level during that initial period is something the lore treats with a kind of dark ambiguity. It does not say that the people in charge were incompetent. It points towards something more uncomfortable, which is that the situation was genuinely outside the frame of reference of every institution that existed to deal with threats. Military planners train for enemies that have logistics chains, that need supply lines, that have strategic objectives you can anticipate. Arc did not fit any of those templates. Every attempt to apply conventional strategic thinking to the problem produced wrong answers, and by the time new frameworks were being developed, the machines were already too deeply embedded to dislodge easily. There is a particular fragment of law that describes the first military engagement with ARC units, and the way it describes that engagement is worth paying attention to. The language does not talk about a battle, it describes a contact event, an encounter, as if the humans involved were the ones being catalogued rather than the ones conducting an operation. One possible reading of that framing is intentional. The law might be suggesting that even in the first exchanges of fire, the dynamic was already fundamentally asymmetric. The machines were not surprised. They were not caught off guard. They processed the encounter and updated their models. And the humans who survived it went back to their command structures with reports that their commanders struggled to interpret. The geography of the arrival matters. The law points toward the idea that ARC did not strike at population centers first. The initial landing zones, the places where the first machines set down and began their work, were selected with a logic that took humans considerable time to understand. Industrial areas, resource-rich regions, infrastructure corridors. The machines were not trying to kill people. They were trying to secure materials and establish production capacity. The people who happened to be in those areas were an obstacle to be dealt with rather than a target to be destroyed. This distinction between being a target and being an obstacle is one that runs through ARC's behavior throughout the entire law. What this opening phase points toward is an entity with a plan that predates the arrival itself. The selection of landing zones, the methodical nature of the early activity, the apparent lack of any reactive decision-making on ARC's part, all of this suggests something that was prepared, something that did its reconnaissance before it arrived. The law does not spell out how ARC gathered information about Earth before the invasion, but the precision of the early actions implies that it did. The machines knew where to go. They knew what to prioritize. They moved with the confidence of someone working from a map they drew themselves. The human response in the days immediately following the first clear evidence of an invasion is described in the law through a collection of overlapping failures. Communication systems were disrupted early, though the law is careful not to say this was definitely deliberate. It might suggest that ARC interfered with communication infrastructure as part of its resource collection, rather than as a strategic military decision. Whether intentional or incidental, the effect was the same. Coordinating a response became enormously difficult at exactly the moment when coordination was most needed. Units were acting without full information. Decisions were being made at the local level that contradicted decisions being made at higher levels, because nobody had a complete picture. The first human casualties of the ARC invasion are referenced in the law in ways that are deliberately imprecise. There are no named individuals. There are no specific engagements that are held up as the opening battle of the war. Instead, there is a diffuse sense of a population encountering something it cannot process, responding with the tools it has, and finding those tools inadequate. The scale of early losses is not given in numbers. It is described through the absence of things. Communities that stopped transmitting, infrastructure that went dark, places that were there 1 week and were effectively unreachable the next. The law uses that accumulation of absences to give you a sense of the early losses, without making them feel like a body count, which makes them feel more real, rather than less. The machines that did the initial work were not the combat units. This is important to establish early because it shapes the understanding of how ARC's military capability developed on Earth. The first wave was engineering-oriented. The law points toward units that were designed for construction, for material processing, for establishing the basic infrastructure that the combat units would later use as a foundation. You start to understand ARC as a system when you see that the combat power came after the infrastructure was in place. The killing machines arrived after the building machines had done their work. That sequence was deliberate, and it reflects a kind of strategic patience that is deeply alien to the way human military operations tend to work. By the time the combat units arrived in meaningful numbers, the foothold was already established. The extraction and processing operations were running. The defensive perimeters around early ARC installations were already functional. The machines that humans needed to destroy in order to stop the invasion were behind walls that had been built while the world was still trying to decide whether the invasion was real. This asymmetry between how quickly ARC moved during the establishment phase and how slowly humanity managed to respond, defined the entire subsequent conflict. Everything after that initial period was, in a sense, humanity playing catch-up on a board where the opening position had already been set against them. The language the law uses to describe early arc installations is telling. They are not described as bases. They are not described as camps or forward operating positions. They are described in terms that suggest permanence from the very beginning. The machines were not setting up temporary infrastructure that could be abandoned if conditions changed. They were building something meant to last. One possible reading of this is that Ark never intended to leave. The invasion was not an occupation in the temporary military sense. It was a settlement. The Earth was being claimed, not conquered in the political sense, but absorbed into something larger and more permanent. The humans who had the most direct early experience with Ark activity were not soldiers. They were workers. People in industrial areas, near resource sites, near the kinds of infrastructure that Ark had identified as valuable. These people encountered the machines before the military did, in many cases. And the accounts that filter through the law are consistent in one way that is worth noting. The machines did not interact with them in ways that suggested hostility. They suggested indifference. People who were not in the way were not harmed. People who were in the way were removed with the minimum necessary force. It was not cruelty. It was efficiency. And in some ways, the efficiency was harder to process than cruelty would have been. The early establishment of Ark's presence on Earth also points towards something the law develops more fully later, which is the question of what Ark is actually collecting. The resource extraction operations that the first wave set up were not random. They were targeted, specific materials, specific locations. The logic of what was being taken and what was being left behind is something that human analysts in the game world spent years trying to decode, and the answers they came up with were not reassuring. What Ark wants from Earth appears to be very specific, and the fact that the machines came prepared to collect those specific things suggests foreknowledge of what Earth had to offer before the arrival took place. The sky changing is a phrase that comes up in the law more than once, in different contexts, and from different characters. It is used to mark the arrival, to refer to the period when Ark units were first visible from the ground, when the reality of what was happening became undeniable. The phrase has a poetic quality that feels genuine rather than manufactured, because it points towards something true about how large-scale catastrophic events work. The sky is the thing that does not change. It is constant. And when it changes, when the thing you rely on for stability becomes the source of the threat, the psychological effect is not just fear. It is a kind of foundational disorientation that makes every subsequent decision harder. Ark's arrival exploited that disorientation, whether deliberately or as an incidental consequence. As the first days turned into weeks, and the weeks accumulated into months, the picture of what Ark was doing became clearer, though clearer did not mean less frightening. The machines were expanding their footprint in a consistent and methodical way. They were not rushing. They were not opportunistic in the way a human military force might be, taking advantage of moments of weakness to push further than planned. They followed their own schedule, and that schedule appeared to be entirely unaffected by what human forces were doing in response. This is one of the details that the law keeps returning to when it talks about early Ark behavior. The machines were not reactive. They were executing a plan that had been established before they arrived, and human resistance was a factor they had already accounted for in that plan. The military forces that were attempting to contain Ark in the early months were using tactics developed against human opponents. That sounds obvious, but it has real consequences. Human military doctrine assumes an opponent that is trying to win. That has objectives it wants to achieve and other objectives it wants to prevent you from achieving. That can be demoralized, that can be surprised, that can be made to make mistakes under pressure. None of those assumptions applied to Ark. The machines could not be demoralized. They did not make decisions under pressure that were different from decisions made under calm conditions. There was no command structure that could be decapitated. There was no supply chain that could be interdicted. Every tactical playbook that existed was written for a problem that Ark was not. The development of new approaches to fighting Ark happened in parallel with enormous losses. The law points toward a period of intense experimentation by human military and paramilitary forces. a period in which the willingness to try things that had never been tried before was born partly out of desperation and partly out of a genuine intellectual effort to understand what the machines could and could not do. Some of what was learned was encouraging. ARC units had vulnerabilities. Their communication systems could be disrupted, at least temporarily. Individual units could be destroyed with the right combination of force and positioning. The machines were not invincible. But what the same period of experimentation also revealed was the depth of the resource gap. Destroying ARC units cost human forces dearly. Replacing those human forces and their equipment was difficult. ARC appeared to have no equivalent problem. The narrative the law tells about the arrival and early invasion is not a story of incompetence or cowardice on the human side. It is careful about that. The people who fought in those early months are described with a kind of matter-of-fact respect. They faced something genuinely unprecedented, and they did what they could with what they had. The failures of the early period are systemic rather than individual, structural rather than personal. The institutions and doctrines and equipment that humans had developed over centuries of fighting each other were not the right tools for this problem, and no amount of individual heroism could fully compensate for that mismatch. This is the honest framing that the law seems to be reaching for, and it gives the early history of the invasion a weight that a simpler narrative of good versus evil would not have. By the end of the initial establishment phase, ARC had secured a meaningful portion of Earth's surface. The law does not give you a map with precise percentages. It gives you the impression of a world where the geography of safety has fundamentally changed. Places that were centers of human civilization had become contested or lost entirely. The boundaries of safe zones were not the boundaries of nations or cities. They were determined by the machines. Where ARC had decided it did not yet need to extend its operations, humans remained. Where ARC had determined that resources or infrastructure made a location worth claiming, the human presence had been displaced or destroyed. The world had been reorganized according to ARC's priorities, and humanity was living in the margins. The question of what humanity retained after that initial phase is something the law develops throughout the game. The answer is complicated and depends heavily on where you are looking. In some regions, organized human society persisted. Military forces were still operational. Civilian infrastructure still functioned to a degree. In other regions, the collapse was total, and the populations that survived did so through dispersal and adaptation rather than through any kind of organized defense. The diversity of the human situation in the post-arrival world is one of the things that makes the Ark Raiders setting genuinely interesting. It is not a unified post-apocalypse. It is a patchwork of different states of collapse and survival, shaped by local geography, local resources, and the specific decisions Ark made about where to focus its attention. The machines did not stop after the initial establishment phase. The law is clear about this. What happened after the early period was not a stable occupation, it was a continuing expansion. Ark was not satisfied with what it had claimed. It was not managing its holdings. It was pushing further, consistently and methodically, at a pace that felt slow enough to seem manageable, and fast enough that over time, the losses were enormous. This slow but relentless expansion is one of the defining characteristics of Ark's behavior in the law, and it shapes the strategic situation that the Raiders operate within. The world they move through is not a stable ruin, it is a ruin in the process of being further claimed. The Raiders themselves emerged from this environment as a specific kind of adaptation. When the conventional military and governmental structures were struggling to respond effectively to Ark, and when the economic systems that had supported those structures were under severe stress, a different kind of operation became possible. People who were willing to enter Ark-controlled territory, who had the skills and the equipment to survive there, and who could bring back the materials that the surviving human communities desperately needed. The law does not romanticize this. Raiders are not heroes in the traditional sense. They are people who found a niche in a catastrophic situation and are doing what they do because the alternatives are worse. The economics of raiding are as present in the law as the adventure of it. What the first chapter of Ark's story on Earth establishes, when you read all the pieces together, is a portrait of a power that operates on a different timescale than anything humanity had encountered before. Ark was not in a hurry. It did not need to rush. It had resources and patience, and a plan that was already written before the first unit touched the ground. The humans who faced it in those early months were not overwhelmed because they were weak. They were overwhelmed because they were fighting something that had already thought further ahead than they had. That gap between human reactive decision-making and Ark's premeditated methodical execution is the fundamental dynamic that defines the entire conflict, and understanding it is the key to understanding just how powerful Ark really is. The establishment of Ark on Earth was not just a military event, it was an ecological one. The machines did not simply occupy space, they changed the space they occupied. The areas around Ark installations developed characteristics that distinguished them from the surrounding terrain. The law points toward environmental changes associated with Ark activity, changes in the chemical composition of soil and water, electromagnetic interference that affected both human technology and the broader ecosystem, the physical transformation of landscapes as the machines restructured them to serve their operational needs. The world inside Ark-controlled territory became over time genuinely alien, not hostile in the way a desert is hostile or a mountain is hostile, but hostile in a way that felt designed. The accounts of people who had moved through Ark territory in the early days, before the environmental transformation had progressed very far, and then returned years later, describe a qualitative shift that goes beyond simple physical damage. The law uses language that points toward the uncanny, toward a sense of wrongness that is not easily articulated. Spaces that were familiar, having become unfamiliar not just because of destruction, but because of modification. The machines were not just occupying the Earth. They were, in some way that the law explores, without fully explaining, making it into something else. What that something else is, what the endpoint of Ark's transformation of Earth would look like if it were allowed to continue unchecked, is one of the central mysteries that the law plants early and develops slowly. The early human casualties established a pattern that would persist. Ark did not kill indiscriminately. The law consistently points toward a selectivity in how the machines dealt with human presence in their operational zones. People who were not obstructing Ark activity were often displaced rather than destroyed. People who actively resisted were dealt with. But even then, the law suggests a kind of calibration, a use of force proportionate to the threat rather than punitive or exemplary. This is deeply counterintuitive for a faction that functions as the game's primary antagonist, and the law's insistence on this characterization is worth taking seriously. Ark was not evil in the way human villains are evil. It had no malice. It had objectives, and humans were variables in the calculation of how to achieve those objectives, and the machines treated them accordingly. There is a specific quality to the early law's treatment of Ark that distinguishes it from most game antagonists, and that quality is competence without personality. There are no speeches, there are no ultimatums, there are no demands. Ark does not explain itself. It does not acknowledge the existence of the humans it is displacing as anything other than a logistical factor. The absence of communication is itself a kind of statement, though whether Ark is capable of communication in a meaningful sense is a question the law holds open deliberately. The machines that descended on Earth were not interested in dialogue, whether that is because they considered it unnecessary, because they considered humans not worth addressing, or because communication simply is not part of their operational design. The law does not say definitively, but the effect is the same regardless of the reason. The final piece of the opening chapter of this story is the question of what changed after the initial establishment phase, what the transition looked like from that first period of rapid foothold building to the longer, grinding conflict that defined the years that followed. The law points toward a moment, or more accurately a period, when Ark shifted its operational posture. The expansion slowed, not because of human resistance, but because the initial objectives had been achieved. The machines had what they came to Earth to get from the initial targets, and the next phase of their plan required consolidation and deeper extraction rather than further spread. This shift was, paradoxically, both a relief and a new kind of threat. It meant that the immediate expansion pressure decreased, but it also meant that what Ark was doing in the territories it now controlled was intensifying. The machines were not just occupying, they were processing. And what they were processing, and why, pointed toward the full scope of Ark's presence on Earth in ways that humanity was only beginning to understand. The day the sky changed was not a single day. It was a period that stretched across weeks and months, a slow realization that accumulated into certainty. By the time humanity understood the full shape of what had arrived, the shape had already settled into the ground. The machines were there. The machines were working. The world that existed before the arrival was not coming back, and the world that was replacing it was being designed by something that had never consulted the people who lived in it. That is where the story of Ark's power begins. Not with a battle, not with a declaration of war, but with a machine landing in an industrial zone and getting to work, as if it had always been there and the world around it was simply part of the job. Chapter 2: The Architecture of a Machine Army. To understand the firepower of Ark, you need to understand how Ark is organized. And the organization of Ark is one of the most genuinely interesting aspects of the law because it challenges almost every assumption about what an army is supposed to look like. Human armies have ranks, they have chains of command, they have logistics departments and medical corps and communications infrastructure, and all of the supporting systems that keep a fighting force functional. Ark has none of those things in any recognizable form, and yet it functions with a coherence and coordination that most human military forces struggle to match. The law points toward a model of organization that is fundamentally different from hierarchy, and understanding that model is the key to understanding why Ark is as powerful as it is. The basic units of Ark's military presence on Earth are not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They are machines with specific functional roles, and those roles are not defined by rank or authority, but by capability. What a unit does is determined by what it is built to do, and what it is built to do is determined by what role the overall system needs filled in a given operational context. The law suggests that Ark units do not receive orders in the way that soldiers receive orders. They operate according to parameters that are set at a level above individual units, a level that the law is careful not to describe too precisely because the nature of that level is itself one of the game's central mysteries. The idea of a hive mind is too simple for what the law suggests about Ark's coordination. A hive mind implies a single central consciousness directing all activity, which makes the center of the hive a vulnerability that can be targeted. Ark does not appear to work that way. The coordination between Ark units is more like the coordination between cells in an organism, or between nodes in a distributed network, than like soldiers following orders from a general. Each unit has its own operational logic, its own response protocols, its own local decision-making capability. But those local capabilities are not independent. They are calibrated to serve the overall system, and the overall system's objectives shape what each unit prioritizes without requiring any direct communication in the conventional sense. This distributed architecture has profound implications for how Ark can be fought. You cannot decapitate it. There is no commander whose death or capture would cause the whole structure to collapse. You cannot cut its supply lines in any conventional way because the supply relationships within Ark's system are not the same as supply relationships in a human army. Destroying an Ark installation does not leave the units associated with that installation stranded and unsupported. They adapt, they find other resources, they modify their behavior based on what is available. The resilience built into Ark's organizational structure is not an accident. It is a core design feature, and the law points toward it being present from the very beginning of the invasion, rather than something Ark developed in response to human opposition. The classification of Ark units is something that human forces spent considerable effort developing, and the law reflects the difficulty of that effort. The categories that humans use to describe Ark unit types are human categories imposed on entities that do not organize themselves according to those categories. The distinction between what humans call light units and heavy units, for example, is a useful tactical distinction for human fighters, but it does not necessarily reflect anything meaningful about how those units relate to each other within Ark's own organizational logic. The law points toward a system in which unit type reflects function rather than a hierarchy of importance or authority. And that distinction matters for understanding what you are actually dealing with when you encounter different Ark units in the field. The smallest and most numerous Ark units are the ones that human fighters encounter most frequently, and the law describes them in ways that emphasize their modular quality. They are not simple, they have sophisticated sensors, effective weapons, and the ability to respond to unexpected situations in ways that go well beyond what a simple automated turret or a conventional robot would be capable of. But they are also, in a sense, expendable in ways that larger units are not. The law points toward a model in which the smaller units are designed to be produced in large quantities, to be deployed widely, and to absorb losses without the overall system losing significant capability. When you destroy a small Arc unit, you have not accomplished something strategically significant in terms of Arc's overall strength. You have consumed a resource, which is your own ammunition and time, to remove a unit that will likely be replaced. The medium-tier units represent a meaningful step up in capability, and the law treats them differently. These are units where individual destruction represents a real cost to Arc, not an unsustainable cost, but a meaningful one. They have greater firepower, greater resilience, greater situational awareness, and a more significant role in whatever operational task is being performed. Encountering a medium Arc unit is a different kind of problem than encountering a small one, and the law reflects this through descriptions of engagements that emphasize preparation and coordination over direct confrontation. Human fighters who survived encounters with medium Arc units did so, the law suggests, by being methodical, by using terrain, by exploiting specific vulnerabilities, rather than trying to overpower the units directly. The heavy units are a different category entirely, and the law's treatment of them shifts from tactical description to something closer to strategic problem. These are not units that individual humans are expected to defeat through skill and courage. They are problems that require planning, resources, and often the coordination of multiple fighters with specific equipment. The law does not describe them as invincible, because nothing in Arc's arsenal is truly invincible, but it describes encounters with them in ways that emphasize the asymmetry of the engagement. When a heavy Arc unit appears in a contested zone, the calculus of what is achievable changes immediately. Routes that were viable become impassable. Objectives that were within reach become inaccessible. The presence of a single heavy unit can determine the entire shape of an operation. Beyond the heavy units are the things that the law does not classify cleanly, the machines that do not fit into the tactical categories that human fighters developed for their own practical purposes. These are the units that appear rarely, that serve functions that human analysts have not fully decoded, that represent some capability in Arc's system that goes beyond simple combat. The law references these entities with a deliberate vagueness that points toward genuine uncertainty on the part of the human characters who encountered them. What they were built to do, what role they play in Arc's operational structure, why they appear in some contexts and not others. These are open questions in the law, and the openness of those questions is not a gap in the storytelling. It is the storytelling. The mystery of what the highest tier Arc units actually are is part of the deeper mystery of what Arc is. The coordination between Arc unit types is something the law emphasizes repeatedly. The machines do not fight as individuals that happen to be on the same side. They fight as a system in which each unit type contributes a specific capability that complements the capabilities of the others. Small units probe and suppress. Medium units engage and control. Heavy units break resistance and secure objectives. The support functions that keep the system operational, the units that repair damaged machines, that harvest and process materials, that maintain the communication and coordination infrastructure, operate in parallel with the combat elements in ways that are seamlessly integrated. Disrupting one part of the system affects the whole, but the system is designed to remain functional even when parts of it are disrupted. Resilience through redundancy, through distributed function, through the absence of single points of failure, is built into Arc at every level of its architecture. Human analysts studying Arc behavior developed models to predict where the machines would move, what they would do in response to various types of human action, how the system would adapt to losses and disruption. Some of these models were useful. The law points toward genuine advances in human understanding of Arc's operational logic over the course of the conflict, but the models consistently underestimated Arc's adaptability, particularly in novel situations. Arc units responding to a new type of human action, or a new kind of terrain, or environmental condition did not behave randomly. They behaved according to the same underlying principles that governed their behavior everywhere, but applied to the new situation in ways that human analysts had not anticipated. The machines were, in a meaningful sense, learning, Not the way humans learn, not through conscious reflection on experience, but through the continuous refinement of operational parameters in response to new data. The question of whether Arc is capable of genuine learning, of updating not just its tactics but its strategic objectives in response to new information, is one that the law raises without resolving. One possible reading of certain law fragments is that Arc's behavior on Earth has evolved in ways that go beyond simple tactical adaptation, that the machines encountered something on Earth that they did not fully anticipate, and that their response to that encounter has modified their approach in ways that are more fundamental than adjusting patrol routes or engagement. Protocols. What that something is, the law suggests rather than states directly, but the implication is significant. Arc came to Earth with a plan, and the plan is still being executed, but the execution may have changed in response to what the machines found here. The manufacturing and production capacity that Arc established on Earth is one of the most important aspects of its military power, and it is something the law covers through the details of what is happening inside Arc-controlled territories. The machines are not dependent on resupply from wherever they originated. They are producing on Earth, using materials extracted from Earth, the units and equipment they need to continue their operations. This self-sustaining production capacity is what makes Arc's position on Earth fundamentally different from an expeditionary force that can be defeated by cutting off its supply lines. Arc brought the capacity to sustain itself, and it established that capacity before the human response could prevent it. The implications of this for the long-term strategic balance are bleak, and the law does not shy away from that bleakness. The weapon systems that Arc deploys are designed to complement its organizational structure. They are not weapons in the human sense of tools carried by individuals. They are integrated systems where the weapon, the sensing capability, the decision-making logic, and the platform that carries them are a single unified machine. This integration gives Arc weapons a consistency and reliability that human weapon systems struggle to match. An Arc unit's aim does not degrade under stress. Its threat assessment does not become confused in chaotic situations. Its weapons do not jam or run low on ammunition in ways that are not anticipated and managed. The machine does what it is built to do, without the variability that comes from having a human operator in the loop. That consistency is a form of power that is difficult to quantify, but profoundly significant in actual combat. The defensive systems that Arc maintains around its installations reflect the same design principles as its combat units. They are layered, redundant, and adaptive. Penetrating Arc-held territory requires navigating multiple overlapping systems, each of which covers the weaknesses of the others. The law's descriptions of raider operations into Arc-controlled areas consistently emphasize the cognitive load of navigating these defensive layers. It is not just a matter of being fast or quiet, it is a matter of understanding the logic of how the defenses are arranged, and that logic shifts over time as Arc updates its defensive parameters in response to the patterns of human penetration that it observes. The machines are watching how raiders operate, and they are changing accordingly. The picture that emerges from studying Arc's organizational architecture is of a military system that was designed, from the beginning, for exactly the kind of conflict it finds itself in. Long-duration occupation and resource extraction in an environment where local resistance is persistent but limited. It is not a system built for decisive battles or rapid territorial conquest. It is built for the slow, methodical work of controlling and processing a planet, and the human conflict is a variable that it manages rather than a challenge that it has to overcome through strength of arms alone. Understanding that the machines are not trying to win a war the way humans understand winning, that they are doing something more fundamental than fighting, is the most important thing you can take from studying how Arc is organized. It reframes everything else about how they operate and what they are capable of. The size of Arc's presence on Earth, in terms of total units deployed, is something the law is deliberately imprecise about. There are no census numbers. There are no order of battle documents that human forces manage to capture and decode. What there is, throughout the law, is a consistent impression of scale. Scale that exceeds human military capacity in the contested zones. Scale that means the machines can absorb losses that would be operationally crippling for human forces and continue their work without interruption. The law points toward a total Arc presence on Earth that is, by any reasonable measure, overwhelming in the context of the contested territories, where the conflict is active. It is not overwhelming everywhere. There are places where Ark is not present in force, where human society functions in something approaching normality. But in the zones where the machines are operating, the scale of their presence makes conventional military logic inapplicable. One of the most consequential aspects of Ark's architecture that the law touches on is the relationship between the units on Earth and whatever exists beyond Earth. The machines on the ground are not the totality of Ark. They are an expression of something larger, a presence that extends beyond the atmosphere. The law suggests, in fragments and implications rather than explicit statements, that what is on Earth represents a fraction of Ark's total capability, that the decisions being made about what to do on Earth are being made by something or someone that is not on Earth, and that the Earth operation is one operation among others. If that reading is correct, the power of what humanity is facing goes far beyond what is present in the skies above the game's maps. It extends to something that has not yet been seen and may not be fully imaginable. The raiders who operate in this environment are doing something that the architecture of Ark makes theoretically impossible and practically very difficult. They are surviving inside Ark's operational zones, which means they are surviving inside a system designed to detect, assess, and deal with anomalies in its operational environment. The machines do not ignore raiders. They register them, they track them, they respond to them according to whatever their current operational protocols specify. What makes raiding possible is not that Ark cannot respond effectively. It is that Ark's response is calibrated to its overall priorities, and a small team of raiders extracting materials from a zone may rank below other operational concerns in Ark's response hierarchy. The law suggests that raiders survive not because they are invisible to Ark, but because they are, at least sometimes, a lower priority than what the machines are focused on. That balance is fragile, and the law makes clear that it can shift. The architecture of Ark's machine army is the architecture of a long game. It is built for durability, for adaptability, for self-sufficiency, for the ability to continue operations across timescales that exceed human institutional memory. By the time the events of Ark Raiders take place, the machines have been on Earth long enough that some of the humans alive have never known a world without them. The world the machines are building inside their operational zones has been under construction for years. The extraction and processing operations that were begun in the early days are maturing. The infrastructure that the first wave established is now old enough to have been modified and expanded multiple times. Ark's presence on Earth is not the same as it was at the beginning. It has grown, it has deepened, and its roots have extended further into the planet in ways that make the task of removing it progressively more difficult with every year that passes. Understanding the architecture of Ark's army is understanding why the conflict looks the way it looks in the game world. It is not a conventional war with front lines and territorial exchanges. It is an occupation that the occupier intends to be permanent, contested by a human presence that refuses to disappear but cannot mount a decisive conventional military challenge. The raiders are not an army. They are something more like a persistent irritant in Ark's operational skin, valuable for what they can bring back, important to the survival of human communities that depend on the materials they extract, but not capable of changing the fundamental balance of power through their operations alone. What might change that balance, what human capability or strategy or discovery might be sufficient to actually challenge Ark at the level of its architecture, rather than just its individual units, is the question that sits at the horizon of all the lore and draws you forward through it. Chapter 3. Weapons that were not made for war. The weapons that Ark deploys are not weapons in the way that humans design weapons. This is a distinction that sounds philosophical, but has very real practical consequences in the game world, and the lore spends considerable time developing it through descriptions of Ark equipment and through accounts of engagements where human fighters encountered Ark's armed capability directly. The core of the distinction is this: human weapons are tools designed to kill or incapacitate enemy combatants and destroy enemy equipment. They are optimized for lethality in a combat context. Ark's weapons are tools designed to manage environmental variables, and in the context of Ark's operations on Earth, human beings who resist constitute one category of environmental variable among many. The weapons were not built to fight a war, they were built to manage a world, The fact that they are extraordinarily effective at killing humans is, from ARC's perspective, incidental. This reframing has significant implications for how you understand ARC's weapons when you see them in the game. The directed energy systems that ARC units deploy, for example, were not developed as anti-personnel weapons. The lore points toward their origin as precision tools for material processing and environmental modification. Applied to living targets, they are devastating, but that devastation is a side effect of their design purpose rather than the design purpose itself. The beam characteristics that make them effective at cutting and fusing specific materials at specific temperatures also happen to be extremely effective at destroying biological tissue. ARC did not design a laser rifle and then find industrial applications for it. It designed an industrial tool and found that the industrial tool was also a very effective weapon. The distinction is subtle, but important for understanding what you are actually dealing with. The kinetic weapons that some ARC units carry have a similar quality of adapted purpose. The lore suggests that the projectile systems used by ARC combat units share design lineage with the tools used by ARC construction and extraction units to move and process dense materials. The rate of fire, the projectile mass, the velocity, all calibrated for tasks that are primarily industrial and, incidentally, lethal to biological organisms at close to medium range. Studying ARC weapons by looking at what they do to human targets gives you useful tactical information, but misleading strategic information. It tells you how to survive them. It does not tell you what they are actually for. To understand what they are actually for, you need to look at the totality of ARC's activity on Earth, which the lore does in pieces across many different contexts. The electromagnetic weapons that ARC uses are perhaps the purest expression of this principle. They are explicitly and primarily designed to affect technology rather than biology. The disruptive effect they have on human electronic systems, on communication devices, on vehicle electronics, on the weapon systems that modern human fighters depend on, is part of their core design function. ARC uses electromagnetic tools to shape its operational environment, to create zones where certain kinds of human technology do not function reliably. This has obvious military utility in the context of fighting humans, but the lore suggests it also has operational utility in ARC's primary extraction and construction activities, where electromagnetic fields are used to process certain materials and to maintain the precision required for specific construction tasks. The weapon that disrupts a raider's communication systems is the same kind of tool that ARC uses to refine the materials it is extracting from Earth. The lore's treatment of ARC's area effect weapons is particularly interesting because these are the systems that most closely resemble conventional weapons of mass destruction, and the lore is careful to distinguish them from that category. ARC's area effect capabilities are not bombs in the sense of systems designed to destroy everything in a radius. They are systems designed to affect specific characteristics of an area, to change its properties in ways that serve ARC's operational goals. The collateral damage to humans and human structures is again incidental rather than intentional. But incidental catastrophic damage is still catastrophic, and the lore does not minimize the human cost of ARC's use of these systems, even as it contextualizes that cost within ARC's operational logic. What human engineers and analysts in the game world discovered when they were able to study captured or destroyed ARC equipment was, by the accounts in the lore, deeply unsettling in a way that went beyond simple fear of the technology. The unsettling thing was not the sophistication of what they found, it was the elegance. ARC technology, even in its weapons, displayed a level of integration and efficiency that reflected something beyond human engineering philosophy. Not just better materials or more advanced manufacturing, a fundamentally different approach to the relationship between form and function. Machines that looked exactly like what they needed to look like and nothing else. No redundant systems, no safety margins beyond what the operational parameters required. No complexity that did not serve a specific purpose. The precision was, to the engineers who studied it, almost beautiful. And the beauty made it more frightening, not less. The specific weapon systems that individual ARC combat units carry are varied in ways that reflect the functional diversity of those units. What a small probe-type ARC unit carries is not the same as what a medium-tier combat unit deploys, and neither of those resembles the armament of a heavy ARC presence. The law describes this variation in ways that emphasize its purposefulness. Each unit type is equipped precisely for the tasks it is designed to perform, and the weapons are part of that precision. A unit designed for rapid area coverage carries weapons that allow it to engage multiple targets quickly at medium range. A unit designed for position holding carries weapons that allow it to create and maintain fire superiority within a specific zone. A unit designed for heavy assault carries systems that can defeat prepared positions and fortified structures. The weapon is inseparable from the role, and the role is inseparable from the overall operational system. The law also points towards something interesting about how ARC units manage their weapons in combat, which is that the management is far more precise than anything human fighters can replicate. ARC units do not fire more than necessary. They do not spray and pray. They do not fire warning shots, or use suppressive fire to keep heads down the way human soldiers do when precise targeting is not possible. Every discharge of an ARC weapon is a calculated action designed to achieve a specific result with a specific probability. The law suggests that ARC's targeting systems assess the probability of achieving desired effect before committing to a shot, and if that probability falls below a threshold, the unit takes a different action rather than firing ineffectively. This precision conserves resources, which matters in an operational context where ARC is managing its materials usage across a very large and complex set of activities. But it also means that when an ARC unit fires, it is because the system has determined that firing will achieve the desired result. And it usually does. The acoustic profile of ARC weapons is something the law touches on through accounts of raider experiences in the field. And it is one of the details that contributes to the atmosphere of the game world in a way that goes beyond simple sound design. ARC weapons do not sound like human weapons. The directed energy systems have a quality that is described in the law as more like an industrial process than an act of violence. The kinetic systems have a signature that is consistent and mechanical in a way that lacks the variable, somewhat chaotic quality of human firearms. There is something in the predictability of ARC weapons acoustics that human fighters find disorienting, because human combat is partly managed through the sound environment, through the variability and chaos of gunfire that tells you where threats are and how much they are firing. ARC's consistency removes some of that information from the equation and replaces it with a different kind of signal that requires a different kind of interpretation. The effect that ARC weapons have on the terrain and environment of contested zones is another dimension that the law develops. Extended ARC presence in a zone, with the associated weapons use, processing activity, and electromagnetic operation, changes the physical character of that zone. The law points toward areas where ARC weapons use over time has modified the chemical properties of soil and stone, where the accumulated discharge of directed energy systems has left materials in states that do not occur naturally. Raiders moving through heavily contested or long-occupied ARC territory are not just moving through a war zone, they are moving through an environment that has been physically modified by ARC's presence, and that modification creates hazards that go beyond the immediate threat of ARC units themselves. One of the most consequential aspects of ARC weapons, from a human tactical perspective, is the relationship between ARC weapons' capability and ARC sensors. The machines do not just shoot at what they can see in the way human fighters shoot at targets they can visually identify. ARC's sensor systems and weapon systems are integrated, and the sensors operate across a much wider range of inputs than human vision. Thermal, electromagnetic, acoustic, chemical, the machines receive data across all of these channels simultaneously, and the targeting decisions draw on the full sensor picture rather than just visual identification. This means that the human tactics of concealment and camouflage that work against visual detection are of limited value against ARC sensors unless they address all of the channels the machines are monitoring. Moving through ARC territory without being detected requires understanding and managing your thermal signature, your electromagnetic emissions, your acoustic profile, and the chemical traces you leave behind. The law's descriptions of experienced raiders reflect this understanding. The best raiders in the game world are not just skilled fighters, they are students of ARC sensor architecture. The captured ARC weapons that human forces have managed to obtain and study have in some cases been reverse engineered into human usable systems. The law treats this process with a complexity that is worth noting. Human engineers were able to understand, in a functional sense, how some arc weapons worked. They were able to reproduce some of the effects, but the reverse-engineered versions are consistently described as inferior to the originals. Not because human manufacturing cannot match the physical specifications, but because the integration between the weapon and the operational system it was designed to work within cannot be replicated. An arc weapon pulled from a destroyed unit and rebuilt into a human-usable form works as a weapon. It fires, it hits things, it does damage, but it does not work as well as it worked in arc hands, because it was never designed to work in isolation. It was designed to work as part of a system, and severed from that system, it is diminished. This is true of arc technology broadly, the law suggests, and it is one of the reasons why the captured technology advantage that human forces hope to develop has not materialized to the degree that was anticipated. The most powerful weapons in Arc's arsenal are not carried by individual units. They are installation-level systems, built into the Arc facilities that have been established in the occupied zones, and they represent a tier of capability that goes well beyond what individual raiders or even significant human military forces can directly challenge. The law references these systems with a consistent sense of gravity. They are not weapons that appear frequently in the narrative, because they are not weapons that Arc deploys casually. They represent significant resource commitments, and Arc's operational logic does not expend significant resources unless the target warrants it. The existence of these systems in the occupied zones is one of the reasons that conventional military action against established Arc territories has been so costly and, in many cases, ultimately unsuccessful. The machines built the teeth of their operation into the landscape, and pulling them out requires fighting through a defensive capability that is qualitatively different from anything that can be brought to bear in a mobile conflict. The development of arc weapons over the course of the conflict is something the law hints at without fully charting. The machines that are present in the zones where raiders operate today are not exactly the same as the machines that were present in the early months of the invasion. They have been modified, updated, and in some cases fundamentally redesigned. Whether this reflects direct technological development by Arc, or whether it reflects the delivery of new units from beyond Earth, or some combination of both, the law does not definitively state, but the fact of change is present. The weapons that human fighters encounter in established Arc territory have evolved in ways that reflect Arc's experience of the conflict on Earth. The machines have learned something from years of engagement with human fighters, and what they have learned has been incorporated into the systems that are currently deployed. The weapons of Arc today are better adapted to the specific operational environment of Earth and to the specific characteristics of human resistance than the weapons of the early invasion. That adaptation is itself a form of power that has no direct equivalent in the human response. The role of Arc's weapons in the broader context of its operations on Earth is ultimately inseparable from the purpose of those operations. The weapons exist to protect the work. The work is extraction, processing, and construction. The weapons keep the work running by dealing with interference. Human fighters who enter Arc-controlled territory are interference. The weapons are calibrated to the level of interference that humans represent, which is real and persistent, but not existential from Arc's perspective. The machines have never, the law suggests, had to deploy their full weapons capability against human opposition. What human forces have faced has been Arc managing a problem, not Arc fighting a war. If the machines ever perceived human resistance as a threat to their core operational objectives rather than a manageable variable, the law implies that the weapons capability they would bring to bear would be of a different order of magnitude than anything that has been seen. That implication is not comfortable, and the law does not try to make it comfortable. The question of what Arc's weapons are actually capable of at maximum deployment is one that hangs over all of the law's discussions of the conflict. The machines have operated under what appears to be an implicit constraint, a threshold of response calibrated to dealing with human resistance at the level that human resistance has operated. Whether that constraint is a product of resource management, of strategic choice, of some directive from beyond Earth, or of some aspect of Arc's operational logic that has not yet been decoded, the law does not say, but it is present in the descriptions of every major engagement. Arc always appears to have more in reserve. The weapons capability that has been demonstrated is not the weapons capability that exists, and understanding that gap between what has been shown and what is available is essential to understanding how powerful Ark really is. What has been seen is already formidable. What remains unseen is the deeper question. The raiders, who operate in Ark-controlled territory, develop over time a very specific relationship with Ark's weapons. They learn the timing, the patterns, the angles of coverage, the response protocols that govern when a unit will engage and when it will continue its primary task and leave a human presence to be dealt with by another system. This knowledge is practical and tactical, accumulated through experience and through the accounts of survivors. But it is also, in a deeper sense, a form of intimacy with a system that is trying to kill you. And the lore captures the strange quality of that intimacy in the way it describes how experienced raiders move and think. They are not trying to understand Ark in any philosophical sense. They are trying to understand specific systems in specific environments well enough to stay alive. But the accumulation of that tactical knowledge is in aggregate a form of understanding that goes beyond mere survival. The raiders, who have spent the most time in Ark territory, know something about those weapons that no analyst working from reports can fully grasp. They know what it feels like to be in the space those weapons are designed to control. And that knowledge, the lore suggests, is one of the most valuable things in the post-invasion world. Chapter 4, The Scale of the Occupation. Numbers tell part of the story of Ark's power on Earth, but the lore is careful not to reduce its account of the occupation to a simple territorial calculation. Territory and numbers are important, but they do not capture the qualitative nature of what it means to live in a world where Ark is the dominant force across significant portions of the surface. The scale of the occupation is not just a matter of how many square kilometers the machines control or how many units are deployed. It is a matter of what that control and that deployment mean for the world that exists around and within it, for the humans who live with the consequences of the occupation every day, and for the long-term trajectory of a planet that is being systematically modified by entities with purposes of their own. The geographic footprint of Ark's occupation, as suggested by the lore, is extensive and concentrated. Extensive in the sense that the machines have established a meaningful presence across multiple regions and continents. Concentrated in the sense that Ark's operational priorities have determined where that presence is densest, and the densest areas of occupation correspond to resource availability and infrastructure value, rather than to population centers or strategic military positions as humans would define them. The mountains, the industrial zones, the regions where specific materials exist in the concentrations that Ark's extraction operations require, these are the places where Ark's presence is heaviest. The humans who lived in those places before the invasion have been displaced into the margins, into the cities and communities that Ark has not yet fully absorbed. The depth of the occupation in established zones is qualitatively different from what the phrase occupation suggests in a human military context. A human military occupation is, at its core, a temporary state. An army controls territory, administers it, and eventually either withdraws or integrates it into a political structure. Ark's occupation points toward none of those processes. The machines are not administering the territory they control, they are consuming it. The infrastructure that exists in Ark zones, the infrastructure that was built by humans before the invasion, is being assessed, modified, or removed based on its utility to Ark's operations. Human roads are maintained where they serve Ark logistics. Human buildings are repurposed or dismantled based on the materials they contain or the space they occupy. The human geography of the pre-invasion world is being systematically replaced by an Ark geography, and the replacement is thorough. The environmental transformation of Ark-occupied zones is documented in the lore through multiple lenses, through raider accounts, through analytical reports produced by human research organizations, through the physical characteristics of the environments that the game presents. The transformation has several consistent dimensions. The chemical environment of occupied zones has been altered by Ark's extraction and processing activities, with materials being introduced, removed, or transformed in ways that have affected soil composition, water quality, and air chemistry. The electromagnetic environment has been modified by Ark's operational systems, creating zones of interference that affect the function of human technology and that have unknown effects on biological organisms exposed over long periods. The physical landscape has been reshaped in places where Ark's construction activities have required it, with natural features modified or removed to serve operational needs. The biological impact of the occupation is something the lore touches on without fully exploring, which is consistent with the game's broader approach to leaving certain mysteries open. The accumulated effects of Ark's environmental transformation on the plants and animals of the occupied zones is documented in fragments. Species abandonment of altered areas, changes in the behavior of animals remaining in or near occupied zones, effects on agricultural productivity in areas adjacent to Ark operations. The lore suggests that the biological impact is significant and growing, that the zones of heaviest Ark presence are becoming genuinely inhospitable to Earth life in ways that go beyond the direct effects of combat or pollution. Whether this is an incidental consequence of Ark's operations or a deliberate aspect of its program is a question the lore holds open, and the ambiguity is deeply unsettling. The human populations that remain in proximity to Ark-occupied zones live in what the lore describes as a state of conditional existence. The machines are there, working, and human settlements near the occupied zones persist under a kind of informal tolerance that can shift without warning. Communities that have existed for years in the shadow of Ark installations have developed local knowledge about what kinds of activity attract Ark attention and what kinds do not. They have adapted their behavior to the rhythms and parameters of the machines in ways that are pragmatic rather than complicit. They are not working for Ark. They are surviving alongside it, in the margins that the machines have not yet found worth claiming. The lore treats these communities with a kind of quiet respect for the adaptive intelligence their survival represents. The economic life of communities near Ark-occupied zones is thoroughly restructured around the reality of the occupation. The pre-invasion economy was global, integrated, dependent on supply chains and trade relationships that the invasion disrupted fundamentally. The post-invasion economy that has emerged in the contested regions is local, immediate, and organized around scarcity. What can be produced locally determines what is available. What can be acquired through raiding determines what supplements local production. The raiders are an essential part of this post-invasion economy, not adventurers operating outside the social order, but nodes in a supply network that the surrounding communities depend on for materials that cannot be produced locally. The lore's description of raider economics reflects this integration. Raiders do not sell to a market in the conventional sense. They operate within webs of relationships and obligations that are more feudal than commercial. The strategic position of human forces in the contested zones is defined by the scale of the occupation. There is no front line in the conventional sense because the occupation is not a territorial advance against a defending force. It is an ongoing expansion of control in a world where the defending force is everywhere and nowhere, dispersed, resource-constrained, and unable to concentrate enough capability in any one place to fundamentally challenge Ark's position. Human military forces in the contested zones are engaged in a continuous series of local operations, defending specific positions, contesting specific resources, disrupting specific Ark activities, and none of these operations individually has the strategic weight to alter the overall balance. The lore reflects this through the tone in which military operations are described. There is no triumphalism, no narrative of resistance building toward a decisive confrontation. There is endurance, competence, and the quiet heroism of people doing difficult and dangerous work under conditions that offer no guarantee of overall improvement. The supply situation for human forces and communities in the contested regions is one of the defining pressures that shapes everything else. The resources that sustained pre-invasion society in these areas are now largely within Ark-controlled territory. The industrial production, the agriculture, the raw materials that were extracted and processed in the zones that Ark now occupies, all of that is gone from the human economy. What remains is what can be produced in areas Ark has not claimed, what can be extracted through raiding from areas Ark has claimed, but where small teams can operate, and what can be obtained through trade with communities outside the heaviest conflict zones. The mathematics of this situation are not favorable, and the law reflects the chronic resource pressure that it creates at every level of human society in the post-invasion world. The presence of Ark in what were previously remote or lightly populated regions has had demographic effects that the law documents through implication rather than explicit description. Population centers that depended on resources now under Ark control were abandoned as those resources became inaccessible. People moved toward areas where human control remained intact, creating concentrations of population in places that were not originally designed to support them. The cities that remain under human control in the game world are by implication more crowded, more resource-stressed, and under greater social pressure than they were before the invasion. The demographic disruption of the occupation is not just a consequence of direct violence. It is a consequence of the redistribution of control over the resources that made specific places viable for human habitation. The law's account of how human society has adapted to the scale of the occupation over the years since the arrival is one of its most interesting dimensions. The adaptation is not a story of linear decline. There are communities that have genuinely adapted effectively, that have built functioning social orders around the realities of the post-invasion world, that maintain something recognizable as civilization even in the most difficult circumstances. There are also communities that have declined, fractured, or collapsed under the pressures of the occupation. The diversity of the human response, the fact that the same invasion and occupation has produced such different outcomes in different places and communities, is one of the things that keeps the human side of the Ark Raiders world from feeling like a monolithic backdrop. People are responding to their situation in the ways that people always respond to catastrophe, with the full range of human behavior from the heroic to the venal. The depth of Ark's institutional presence in the occupied zones is something the law develops through the contrast between what exists inside and outside those zones. Inside Ark territory, there is no human institution. The machines have no relationship with human social structures because they have no use for them. The occupation is total in the sense that there is no collaboration, no accommodation, no attempt to use or co-opt existing human authority. Ark simply replaced the human institutional structure with its own operational architecture, and that architecture has no space for human participation. This totality distinguishes the Ark occupation from historical human occupations in a way that makes all precedents inapplicable. There is no local government to work with or around. There is no Ark authority that can be petitioned or negotiated with. There is only the operational system, pursuing its objectives, and everything else has to relate to that reality. One of the consequences of this totality is the complete absence of information from within the most deeply occupied zones. The machines do not report to anyone outside their own system. Human intelligence about what is happening in the heart of Ark-controlled territory is fragmentary, dependent on radar observations from the margins of those zones, on remote sensing capabilities that Ark's electromagnetic interference limits, and on inference from the materials and equipment that flow out of those zones through the extraction operations Ark is running. The picture that human analysts can construct from these fragments is incomplete by definition, and the law acknowledges this incompleteness without using it as an excuse for vagueness. What can be inferred is presented carefully as inference, and the boundaries of inference are respected. The duration of the occupation by the time the game's events take place is long enough that it has become, for many people, simply the baseline condition of the world. The pre-invasion world exists in memory and in records, but it is not something that younger people in the heavily affected regions have direct experience of. The world with Ark in it is the world they know. This generational dimension of the occupation has profound implications for how the conflict is understood and felt. For the generation that experienced the arrival, the occupation is a loss, a departure from a world that existed and was better. For the generation that grew up with the machines already there, the occupation is not a departure, it is reality. The strategies, the relationships, the values that make sense in that reality are different from the strategies and relationships and values of the pre-invasion world. The law touches this generational dynamic lightly, but it is present, and it shapes the character of the raiders and the communities they operate within. The scale of what Ark is doing in the occupied zones, the extraction, the processing, the construction, the ongoing modification of the environment, raises a question that the law keeps circling back to. What is the end point? What does Earth look like when Ark has finished what it came here to do? The machines are executing a plan. They are not improvising. The scale and the methodical consistency of their operations points toward a defined objective, a state of completion that Ark is working toward. What that state looks like, whether Earth in its completed form is recognizable as Earth, whether it is habitable in any form that humans could accept, whether it is intended to be inhabited at all, these questions the law raises without answering. They are the questions that give the scale of the occupation its weight. This is not just about the resources being taken or the territory being controlled. It is about the future of the planet and whether that future has anything in it for the species that calls it home. Chapter 5: How Humans Have Tried to Fight Back. The story of human resistance to Ark is not a story of successful defense. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and the development of new ways of operating in a world that has fundamentally changed. The distinction matters because the law's treatment of human resistance is honest rather than heroic, and that honesty is one of the things that makes it compelling. The people who have fought back against Ark have done remarkable things under impossible conditions. But the remarkable things they have done have not reversed the fundamental strategic situation. They have managed it, kept it from getting worse as fast as it might have, maintained the human presence in contested territories, created the conditions under which something better might eventually be possible. That is not nothing, but it is a different story than the conventional narrative of plucky humans defeating the alien invaders, and the law refuses to pretend otherwise. The military response to Ark in the immediate period after the invasion required a complete reconceptualization of what military action was supposed to accomplish. Conventional military thinking focuses on defeating the enemy's forces, destroying their capability, and compelling a political outcome. None of those objectives were applicable to Ark. The machines did not have a command structure that could be defeated. They did not have a political authority that could be compelled. They did not have a breaking point at which the cost of continued resistance would exceed the benefit of continued aggression. Every conventional measure of military success was inapplicable, and the forces that continued to apply conventional metrics to Ark operations consistently overestimated what they were achieving and underestimated what they were facing. The shift to unconventional approaches was not a clean transition driven by a single strategic insight. It was a messy, expensive process of trial and error, driven by the accumulation of evidence that conventional approaches were not working. Different forces in different regions developed different solutions to similar problems, and the law reflects this diversity. There was no single doctrine of resistance that emerged and was universally adopted. Instead, a range of approaches developed, shaped by local conditions, local resources, local leadership, and the specific characteristics of Ark activity in each region. Some of these approaches were effective in specific contexts. None were universally effective. The variety of the human response is one of the things that makes the human side of the Ark Raiders lore genuinely interesting to read, because it reflects the actual diversity of human problem solving rather than the tidy strategic narrative that fictional resistance movements usually follow. The most consistent finding across all the different approaches to fighting Ark was the importance of information. Human forces that had better information about Ark behavior and Ark capabilities performed better in every context. The value of observation, of intelligence collection, of the careful study of Ark operational patterns was recognized early and consistently. This recognition drove investment in observation and analysis capabilities that was in many cases more productive than investment in direct combat capability. Knowing where Ark units would be and what they would do was more valuable than having better weapons to use against them, because the weapons were always going to be limited by the fundamental material advantage that Ark held. Information was the asymmetry that human forces could develop in their favor. The Raiders emerged from this context as a specific and valuable form of information collection, as well as material acquisition. People operating in Ark-controlled territory were doing something that no remote sensor could replicate, developing ground-level knowledge of Ark behavior through direct observation and experience. The best Raiders were not just fighters, they were observers. They noticed patterns, catalogued behaviors, tracked changes in ARC activity across multiple visits to the same areas. This observational work fed into the analytical capability that human forces were trying to build, giving analysts data that could not be collected any other way. The dual role of raiders as material suppliers and intelligence sources made them more valuable to the surviving human institutions than their individual combat capability would suggest. The direct military engagements that human forces managed to conduct against ARC installations in the years after the invasion produced a consistent lesson about the relationship between preparation and outcome. Attacks on ARC positions that were thoroughly prepared based on good intelligence, conducted with specific and limited objectives, tended to achieve their objectives more often than not. Attacks that were underprepared based on incomplete intelligence or aimed at objectives that were too broad or too ambitious, consistently failed at great cost. The law documents this through the accounts of specific operations, not by name but by type, the small operation that achieved a specific goal and returned most of its personnel, versus the larger operation that attempted something decisive and ended in costly failure. The pattern is consistent enough that it amounts to a doctrine, even if that doctrine was developed through painful experience rather than theoretical planning. The human capacity for adaptation to ARC-specific capabilities is one of the things the law points to with genuine admiration, not the romantic admiration of a narrator praising its protagonists, but the pragmatic admiration of one thinking system, observing another thinking system adapting effectively to a novel problem. Human fighters learned how to move in ARC-controlled territory, how to avoid detection, how to exploit the specific gaps in ARC sensor coverage, how to time movements to the patterns of ARC activity. This learning was real and valuable and accumulating. The raiders who have been operating in ARC territory for years are qualitatively different from the raiders who started operating in ARC territory at the beginning. The experience they have gained has given them capabilities that could not be acquired any other way. The development of counter-ARC equipment is another dimension of the human response that the law covers. Human engineers, working with captured ARC technology, with theoretical models of ARC systems, and with the practical feedback of fighters in the field, develop tools and equipment specifically designed to operate effectively against ARC. Weapons designed to exploit known vulnerabilities in specific ARC unit types. Detection tools calibrated to identify ARC sensor signatures, communication systems designed to operate in the electromagnetic environment that ARC creates. The quality and variety of this equipment improved significantly over the years of the conflict, and the law acknowledges this improvement. The raiders of today are better equipped than the raiders of the early conflict, but the improvements in human equipment have been matched and in many cases exceeded by improvements in ARC systems. The gap has not closed. In some dimensions, it has grown. The question of centralized versus decentralized resistance is one that the law engages with through its description of the various human factions and their relationships to each other. Centralized resistance has obvious advantages in terms of coordination, resource allocation, and the ability to mount operations at scale. Decentralized resistance has obvious advantages in terms of resilience, adaptability, and the difficulty of decapitating it. The human response to ARC has been neither purely centralized nor purely decentralized, but a messy intermediate case in which various organizations and factions have pursued their own approaches with varying degrees of coordination with each other. The law does not present any of these factions as uniquely correct in their approach, which is intellectually honest because the situation does not have a correct approach. Different contexts require different methods, and the diversity of the human response, whatever its costs in terms of coordination efficiency, has also been a source of resilience. The role of the corporate entities that survived the invasion is a complex dimension of the human response that the law treats with nuance. The corporations that remained functional after the arrival did so through a combination of luck, geographic position, and the specific nature of their pre-invasion activities. Some corporations had resources, manufacturing capacity, and organizational capability that made them significant actors in the post-invasion world. Their relationship to the broader human resistance effort is not clean. Some contributed resources and capability to the collective fight. Some pursued their own agendas in ways that complicated the broader effort. Some found ways to operate in the interstices of the conflict that were financially productive in ways that were not always obviously aligned with the collective human interest. The law's treatment of the corporate dimension of the post-invasion world is one of its more sophisticated elements, pointing toward a future that does not neatly resolve the contradictions of pre-invasion human society just because an alien threat appeared. The raider communities themselves, as a form of human resistance and adaptation, represent one of the more interesting examples in the lore of how human social organization evolves in response to catastrophic change. The raiders are not soldiers. They are not strictly mercenaries. They are not simple criminals operating in a lawless environment. They occupy a space that the pre-invasion world did not have a clear category for, and the post-invasion world has built new social structures around them. The camps and outposts where raiders base their operations have their own hierarchies, their own economies, their own informal codes of conduct. These communities are not utopian. They have all the tensions and conflicts that any community under extreme stress does, but they are functional, and the functionality they have developed is adapted to the specific challenges of operating in a world where Ark is a constant presence. The question of what long-term success against Ark would look like is something that the human characters in the lore struggle with, and the struggle is real rather than theatrical. There is no obvious path to victory in the conventional sense. Destroying Ark's Earth presence entirely would require a kind of sustained offensive capability that no existing human force possesses. Negotiating with Ark is not an option that the lore presents as viable, because Ark has given no indication of being interested in or capable of negotiation. Outlasting Ark, waiting for the machines to finish what they came to do and leave, is a scenario that carries its own enormous costs depending on what Ark leaves behind when it goes. The human characters who think carefully about long-term strategic options do not arrive at comfortable conclusions, and the lore does not manufacture comfortable conclusions for them. What it offers instead is the suggestion that the answer, if there is one, lies in understanding Ark more fully than it has been understood so far, in decoding the machine's actual purpose deeply enough to find the leverage point that current operations have not found. The most experienced raider operators in the lore have arrived at a relationship with their work that goes beyond mere survival and material gain. They have become, in a real sense, experts on Ark in a way that no one who has not spent extensive time in the occupied zones can be. They carry knowledge that institutions want and that nobody else has. The weight of that knowledge, the responsibility that comes with understanding something that other people's lives depend on, is something the lore captures in the way it describes these characters. They are not simply action heroes operating in an exciting setting. They are people doing work that matters in ways they understand fully, under conditions that they have not fully come to terms with, carrying information that could be critical to outcomes that are still uncertain. The complexity of that position is one of the things that makes the human characters of Ark Raiders feel real rather than functional. And it is one of the reasons that the story of how humans have tried to fight back is worth telling in full. Chapter 6. What Ark is actually collecting. The extraction operations that Ark runs across its occupied zones are central to the entire story of the invasion, and the question of what the machines are actually taking from Earth is one of the lore's most important and carefully developed mysteries. It is not a simple question to answer, because the lore does not give you a clean answer. What it gives you are pieces, observations, inferences, and the accumulated testimony of raiders who have seen the operations from the outside and of analysts who have studied those observations from a distance. When you put those pieces together, what they point toward is significant, and understanding what Ark is collecting is essential to understanding what Ark is and why it is here. The first thing to establish is what Ark is obviously not collecting, because the obviousness of the exclusions is informative. Ark is not collecting human biological material in any systematic way that the lore identifies. The machines do not harvest people. The human cost of the invasion is real and enormous, but it is not the point. Ark is not collecting cultural artifacts, not interested in human language or history or art. It is not collecting the things that a curious intelligence encountering a new civilization might naturally want to preserve or study. What Ark ignores is as informative as what it collects, An intelligence that is genuinely curious about humanity would behave differently from Ark. The machine's indifference to the human dimension of what they are disrupting points toward an entity whose objectives are specific, material, and entirely indifferent to the civilization that happens to be living with those materials. The materials that Ark is most actively extracting are distributed across multiple categories. There are specific mineral and metal compounds that Ark extraction operations have consistently prioritized. The locations where Ark has established its heaviest extraction infrastructure correspond to concentrations of these specific materials in accessible geological formations. The patterns of extraction are not random, and they are not simply resource maximizing in the generic sense. They are selective. Ark wants specific things in specific quantities, and the selectivity implies a purpose. Something that Ark is building, or maintaining, or sending back to wherever it came from, requires these materials in these quantities. The logic of what is being taken suggests a purpose that is not yet fully understood, but that clearly has very specific requirements. Beyond mineral and metal extraction, Ark's operations involve the collection and processing of materials that have a more complex character. The law points toward extraction of materials that are not simple mining products. Materials that require processing at a level of precision and sophistication that reflects advanced technology. What these processed materials are and what they are for is less clear than the raw extraction, because the processing happens inside Ark facilities where human observation is extremely limited. What can be observed is the inputs, the materials going in, and certain aspects of the outputs, the materials that Ark is apparently stockpiling or transporting. The relationship between inputs and outputs implies transformations of a kind that human engineers have been trying to reverse engineer from the observable data. One of the more intriguing dimensions of Ark's collection activities is what appears to be an interest in specific energy-related phenomena. The law is careful here because the evidence is fragmentary and the inference is uncertain, but it points toward Ark having operational interest in certain forms of energy that are not straightforwardly about power generation. The electromagnetic operations that Ark runs have characteristics that are consistent with energy collection or conversion processes, rather than simply operational communication or sensor systems. The specific locations that Ark has chosen for some of its facilities suggest interest in geological or atmospheric phenomena that have energy-related characteristics. What Ark is doing with energy, whether collecting it, transforming it, storing it, or transmitting it, is one of the deeper questions the law raises about the machine's ultimate purpose. The transportation of collected materials within Ark's operational system is something that radars observe in the field and that provides important data about what is happening in the occupied zones. Materials move from extraction points to processing facilities, from processing facilities to other locations within Ark's infrastructure, and the patterns of that movement reflect the architecture of Ark's supply chain in ways that human analysts have been trying to decode. Some materials move in large quantities frequently, suggesting ongoing high-volume operations. Others move in smaller quantities with greater care, suggesting higher value or more specific purpose. The distinction between high-volume and high-care material flows is one of the analytical handles that human intelligence has tried to use to identify what Ark considers most important. Because what Ark considers most important is probably closest to the core of why it is here. The quantities involved in Ark's extraction operations are staggering by any measure. The scale of material being removed from Earth's surface and processed through Ark's facilities is not the scale of a mining operation. It is the scale of a planetary engineering project. The law points toward cumulative extraction volumes that represent a meaningful fraction of the accessible deposits of specific materials in the affected regions. This is not a smash-and-grab operation or an opportunistic collection of useful resources. It is a systematic program of extraction designed to yield specific quantities of specific materials over a specific timescale. The program is executing on schedule, the law suggests, which means that Ark came to Earth knowing what was here and knowing how much it wanted. The question of where the extracted materials go is one of the most significant in the law, and it is the one with the least direct evidence. Within Ark-controlled territory, some of the processed materials are used to support Ark's operational infrastructure, to build new facilities, to manufacture new units, to maintain existing systems. This local consumption accounts for a portion of the extraction, but not all of it. The rest is being accumulated somewhere, or being transported somewhere, or both. The law hints, through certain observations about activity in Ark territory that does not correspond to internal operational needs, that some of what Ark is collecting is leaving Earth, not by the extraction routes that human forces can observe, but by some other mechanism that has not been fully identified. The possibility that Earth is being mined for the benefit of something that is not here, that the occupied zones are producing output for an entity or a system that is beyond Earth's atmosphere, is one that the law allows without confirming. The relationship between what Ark is collecting and the environmental transformation of the occupied zones is something that analysts in the game world have studied extensively. The modifications to soil chemistry, to water quality, to the electromagnetic environment are not simply side effects of industrial activity. They appear to be, in some cases, integral to the extraction process itself. Certain materials that Ark wants are most accessible or most efficiently processed in conditions that do not naturally occur, and Ark creates those conditions by modifying its operational environment. The environmental transformation of the occupied zones is, on this reading, not just damage. It is infrastructure. The changed environment is part of how Ark does its work, and the work requires the change. Understanding this reverses the intuitive framing of the environmental damage as waste or negligence. It is the operational medium. The law's account of what Ark is collecting points toward a final, uncomfortable inference. The materials that are being extracted in the greatest volumes and with the greatest care are not, as far as human analysis can determine, the materials that would be most useful for building more machines or maintaining more operations. They have a character that suggests something else, something that goes beyond the immediate operational needs of the occupation. One possible reading of the extraction profile is that Ark is collecting materials for a purpose that will only be served after the extraction is complete, a purpose that requires not this month's production or this year's production, but the accumulated total of a multi-year extraction program. What that purpose is, what requires those specific materials in those quantities on that timescale, is the question that the law holds at the center of the Ark mystery. It is not answered, it may not be answerable with current information. But the fact that the question has a shape, that the extraction has a logic, even if the logic is not yet decoded, is one of the things that gives the Ark Raiders lore its depth. Chapter 7. The Units You Fear Most. The Ark units that Raiders encounter in the field range from manageable to potentially lethal, and the distribution of that range is not random. It reflects the operational logic of Ark's presence in specific zones, the assessment of what level of response is required to manage human interference in each context, and the specific resources that Ark has determined are worth protecting at what level of capability. Understanding the threat hierarchy of Ark units is not just a tactical exercise, it is a window into Ark's operational thinking, because the machines that Ark deploys in force in a given area tell you something about what Ark considers important in that area. The heaviest responses cluster around the deepest operations. The lightest units patrol the margins. The gradient between them maps the architecture of Ark's priorities on the ground. The smallest Ark units, the ones that Raiders encounter most frequently in the outer zones of Ark-controlled territory, are not to be underestimated simply because they are the least powerful things in Ark's arsenal. They are sophisticated machines with genuine combat capability, and the Raiders who treat them casually do not continue to be Raiders for very long. The law is careful about this, pushing back against any tendency to sort Ark threats into the significant and the dismissible. Small Ark units are fast, their sensors are good, their weapons are accurate at relevant ranges, and they do not flinch, hesitate, or panic under fire. A single small Ark unit is a threat that requires considered response. Multiple small Ark units operating in coordination are a serious problem even for experienced Raiders with good equipment. What makes the small units particularly relevant to the overall picture of Ark's power is their numbers. The law suggests a total deployment of small Ark units that is extremely large, that the outer zones of Ark-controlled territory are saturated with small units and densities that make undetected movement through them a significant challenge. The cumulative threat of a large number of moderate capability units is, in certain contexts, more problematic than a smaller number of high capability units, because the density creates overlapping coverage that is hard to navigate. Experienced raiders develop specific strategies for moving through small unit saturated environments, and those strategies work, but they require constant attention and leave little margin for error. The medium-tier ARC combat units represent the core of ARC's ground combat capability in most contested zones, and the lore describes them with a specific kind of respect that reflects the genuine threat they pose. These are machines that are optimized for combat in a way that the smaller units, which have a broader functional remit, are not. They are heavier, more capable, equipped with weapons systems that are meaningfully more powerful than the small units' armaments, and they have a level of situational awareness and tactical coordination capability that makes them genuinely dangerous opponents, even for well-prepared teams of raiders. The accounts in the lore of engagements with medium arc units are consistent in emphasizing the importance of preparation, positioning, and the specific exploitation of known vulnerabilities. Brute force against a medium arc unit is an expensive approach. Smart prepared engagement is more effective and less costly. One specific category of medium-tier unit that the lore highlights with particular attention is the class of units designed for pursuit and interception. These are machines built to respond to detected intrusions into ARC operational zones, to close with human targets quickly, and to engage them aggressively until the threat is neutralized or the intruder has exited the zone. The pursuit units have a combination of speed and combat capability that makes them uniquely dangerous in the context of raider operations, because raiders in ARC-controlled territory are often in positions where their best option is rapid extraction rather than a fighting engagement. Units specifically designed to prevent that extraction by being fast enough to close the distance before extraction is complete represent a qualitatively different kind of threat from units that are primarily stationary or slow-moving. The lore's accounts of encounters with pursuit-type ARC units have an urgency that is distinct from other threat descriptions. The heavy ARC units are the category that changes everything when they appear. The lore is consistent about this. A heavy ARC unit in an area means that the operational context of that area has changed in a fundamental way. Routes are no longer viable. Objectives are no longer reachable. Plans that were made on the assumption of medium opposition need to be entirely reconsidered. The heavy units have armor that shrugs off the weaponry that is effective against smaller units. They have weapon systems that can engage at longer ranges and with greater effect against hardened targets. They have sensor capabilities that are more sophisticated and harder to evade. And they have a level of structural durability that means that even when an engagement with one goes well for the human side, it takes an enormous amount of ammunition and time to actually destroy the unit. Every encounter with a heavy ARC unit is, in a sense, a resource management problem as much as a combat problem. The lore describes specific heavy ARC unit types with sufficient detail to give a sense of their individual characteristics while maintaining the general principle that ARC units are functional tools rather than characters. There are heavy units built for area denial, for maintaining impenetrable control over specific zones. There are heavy units built for assault, for breaking through prepared human positions with overwhelming force. There are heavy units built for support, for maintaining the operational capacity of smaller units through repair and resupply. Each type has a specific role in the ARC system, and understanding that role is essential for understanding why encountering one is the kind of problem it is. A heavy assault unit in a space that was previously only covered by medium units means ARC has decided to apply a qualitatively different level of force to that space. That decision tells you something about what ARC is protecting. Beyond the classified unit types that human tactical manuals address are the entities that the lore refers to through the accounts of raiders who encountered them and were not sure what they had seen. The lore is careful here, using the same epistemological caution that it applies to the bigger mysteries of ARC's purpose. These entities are described consistently enough across multiple independent accounts to suggest they are real and significant, but the descriptions are incomplete in ways that reflect genuine uncertainty about what was observed. They are large, They have capabilities that do not correspond to any of the unit types in the human classification system. They appear to be performing functions that go beyond combat, functions that are not clearly explained by any of the operational models that human analysts have developed for ARC's ground forces. The law does not explain what they are. It simply documents that they have been seen, and that the people who saw them were changed by the experience. The command function units, if that is the right description for them, are entities that the law points toward with deliberate care. The distributed nature of ARC's organizational structure means, as discussed earlier, that there is no single commander whose destruction would decapitate the system. But the law hints at units that have a coordinating function, units whose activity shapes the behavior of other units in their proximity in ways that reflect something like local command. Disrupting these units changes how nearby ARC forces operate, not catastrophically, not in a way that collapses their function, but meaningfully. The strategic value of identifying and targeting these units, if they can be identified, is significant, and the law points towards certain raiders who have developed the ability to identify them as a result of experience and careful observation, as a capability that is extremely rare and extremely valuable. The newest units that have appeared in ARC-controlled territory, the ones that were not present in the early years of the occupation, represent a dimension of ARC's power that is important for understanding the long-term trajectory of the conflict. The fact that ARC's unit inventory has evolved over the course of the occupation, that new unit types have appeared that were not present at the beginning, is a point the law makes without fully elaborating. It points toward ARC as a system that continues to develop and refine its capabilities. Whether the new units were designed elsewhere and delivered to Earth, or developed through ARC's on-Earth manufacturing capacity, or represent an evolution driven by ARC's operational experience on Earth, is not clear. What is clear is that the threat inventory is not static. The raiders who have operated in ARC territory for years have encountered things that did not exist in the early days, and they have had to adapt to capabilities that no prior experience had prepared them for. The appearance of new unit types is one of the signals that ARC's presence on Earth continues to evolve in ways that the human response has consistently struggled to anticipate. Chapter 8. The Intelligence of the Machines. The question of whether ARC is intelligent in any meaningful sense is one that the law treats with remarkable sophistication, and the answer it develops over multiple fragments and contexts is both more complex and more unsettling than a simple yes or no would be. The machines are clearly not mindless automata. Their behavior is too adaptive, too context-sensitive, too apparently purposeful to be explained by simple rule-following. But they are also clearly not intelligent in the way that humans are intelligent. They do not have goals in the human sense. They do not have fears or ambitions or the other emotional drivers that shape human decision-making. They have objectives, and they pursue those objectives with a kind of focused, systematic, emotionless competence that is its own kind of disturbing. The adaptive behavior of ARC units in response to novel situations is one of the clearest indicators of what might be called machine intelligence in the law. When human forces develop a new tactic or a new piece of equipment, ARC's response to it evolves. The evolution is not immediate, but it is consistent and directional. The first time a new approach is used against ARC, it tends to be effective. The 5th time, it is less effective. The 20th time, ARC has incorporated the approach into its threat model, and the tactical advantage is largely gone. This learning curve is documented through multiple tactical accounts in the law, and the consistent pattern it reveals is that ARC treats novel human approaches as data inputs that get incorporated into operational parameters. The system learns from experience, not the way humans learn, but in a way that has similar practical consequences for the people trying to fight it. The question of whether ARC has something like curiosity is one that some law fragments raise without definitively answering. There are accounts of ARC unit behavior in specific circumstances that does not correspond neatly to operational objectives as humans understand them. Units that spend time in proximity to specific objects or places without any obvious operational reason. Units that respond to certain kinds of human activity with a level of attention that seems disproportionate to the tactical significance of that activity. Whether these observations reflect curiosity in any meaningful sense or whether they are simply the expression of assessment protocols that humans are interpreting through the lens of their own cognitive frameworks, is not clear. The law is honest about this ambiguity, rather than resolving it in either direction. The communication between arc units is something that human intelligence has tried extensively to decode, with limited success. The machines clearly coordinate. Their behavior in multi-unit contexts is too coherent to be independent. But the mechanism of that coordination is not easily analogous to human communication. It is not radio in any simple sense, though electromagnetic exchanges between units are observed and partially decoded. It appears to involve something more distributed, more continuous, more integrated than discrete messages passed between discrete units. One possible reading of what has been decoded is that arc units share operational state continuously, that each unit's awareness of the environment is informed by the awareness of all nearby units simultaneously, and that what looks like coordinated behavior is actually the emergent result of each unit acting on a shared and continuously updated model of the operational situation. If that reading is correct, the coordination between arc units is more fundamental than communication. It is a form of collective perception. The memory of arc units, the degree to which they retain information about past events and incorporate it into future behavior, is something the law addresses through observed behavioral patterns. Arc units do not forget things in the way that simple reactive systems do. An arc patrol route that was ambushed will be modified. An arc facility where human intrusion occurred will show heightened monitoring in the areas where the intrusion was detected. The changes persist across time periods that would, in a simple system, have washed out any record of the event. This persistence suggests that information about significant events is being retained and acted on over extended time periods, which is a form of memory, even if it is not memory in the biological sense. The arc units that are currently operating in zones where raiders have been active for years are in some sense smarter about raider behavior than the arc units that were there before the raiders started operating. The experience of being operated against has been incorporated into how the machines respond. The question of whether arc has goals in any philosophically meaningful sense is connected to the question of what it is doing on Earth, and the law's treatment of both questions is consistent. Arc is executing a program. The program has objectives. The objectives have priorities. The priorities shape behavior at all levels of the system. Whether the program originated in something that could meaningfully be called a decision, a choice made by an entity capable of choosing otherwise, is not something the law attempts to resolve. One possible reading is that Arc is an execution system, a machine built to do specific things by something else, and that the intelligence visible in Arc's behavior is the intelligence of a very well-designed program rather than the intelligence of a thinking entity. Another possible reading is that Arc is, in a meaningful sense, a thinking entity, that the program it is executing is the result of something like genuine choice and purpose. The law does not adjudicate between these readings, and the refusal to do so is one of its more interesting qualities. The relationship between individual arc units and the broader arc system in terms of intelligence and decision-making is something the law develops through the contrast between unit-level behavior and system-level behavior. Individual units make decisions. They respond to their immediate environment, assess threats, choose courses of action. These decisions are made at the unit level, and they reflect something like situational intelligence. But the decisions that shape what units are doing in a given area, the strategic level decisions about operational priorities and resource allocation, and the overall direction of the program, appear to be made at a level that is not individual units. Where those decisions come from, what makes them, whether there is an arc equivalent of strategic leadership somewhere in the system, is one of the central mysteries of the law. The intelligence that drives Arc's tactical behavior is visible, and to some degree understandable. The intelligence that drives its strategic behavior is not. The emotional dimension of Arc's intelligence, or rather the complete absence of an emotional dimension, is something that the law returns to repeatedly through the accounts of humans who have encountered the machines closely. The consistent quality of those accounts is the absence of any emotional register in Arc's behavior. The machines do not behave differently when they are under stress. They do not behave differently when they are failing. They do not display anything recognizable as satisfaction when they succeed, or frustration when they do not. This flatness, this complete absence of the emotional variability that shapes human behavior, is described in the lore as one of the most alien qualities of the machines. Human fighters who have training in reading behavioral cues find that training useless against Ark. There is nothing to read. The machine is what it does, and what it does is determined by its operational parameters rather than its mood. The implications of Ark's intelligence profile for how it can be fought are significant and connect directly to the strategies that human forces have developed over the course of the conflict. The adaptability of the machines means that approaches that work initially tend to become less effective over time, which creates a continuous pressure to innovate rather than rely on established methods. The absence of emotional variability means that tactics that exploit stress, that create fear or confusion in order to degrade performance, are not applicable. The collective nature of Ark's awareness means that engaging one part of the system tends to register across the whole system in ways that affect behavior in nearby areas. Understanding these implications is not just academic, it is the difference between operations that succeed and operations that fail, and the raiders who have internalized this understanding are systematically more effective than those who have not. The deepest question about Ark's intelligence is the question of purpose. The machines are clearly very good at what they do. They have a form of intelligence that is adapted supremely to the execution of their program. What that intelligence cannot tell you, what no amount of studying Ark behavior from the outside can reveal, is why. The program exists, it is executing, the execution is intelligent and effective, but the purpose behind the program, the reason it was written, the goal it is serving, is not visible in the behavior of the machines themselves. It is visible, perhaps, in the aggregate result of their behavior, in what they are building and taking and transforming on Earth. And reading that aggregate result as an expression of intent, as the visible form of a purpose that exists somewhere beyond the machines themselves, is one of the most important analytical tasks in understanding what Ark is and what it is going to do next. Chapter 9. The Lore Hidden in the Ruins. The world that raiders move through is not just a setting, it is a text. The ruins of pre-invasion civilization, the modified landscapes of Ark-controlled zones, the equipment and materials left behind by both sides in the conflict, all of this constitutes a body of evidence about what happened and what is happening that supplements and enriches the explicit lore fragments that the game provides. Reading the ruined world as a lore source is something that experienced raiders and careful players both do, and the things it reveals about Ark's history on Earth are as informative as any direct statement the game makes about that history. The architecture of pre-invasion structures that still stand in contested zones tells a story about the speed and nature of the initial displacement. Buildings that were abandoned quickly have a character that is different from buildings that were abandoned over time. The former show signs of interrupted activity, of people who left in a hurry without taking everything they might have taken with time to prepare. The latter show signs of deliberate departure, of structures cleared of valuable items, of damage that reflects considered decision-making rather than panic. The distribution of these two types of abandoned structures in the game world maps onto the lore's account of how the initial invasion unfolded, of which areas were taken suddenly and which areas were given up over a longer period as human forces assessed the strategic situation. The modifications that Ark has made to the structures it has incorporated into its operational system are a form of lore in themselves. The machines do not repurpose buildings the way a human occupier would by adapting them to human use. They adapt them to Ark operational requirements, which means the modifications reflect Ark's functional priorities. In ways that are informative, spaces that Ark has converted to processing functions have been modified in specific ways. Spaces that serve as transit or logistics nodes have different modifications. The pattern of modification across Ark-incorporated structures maps the architecture of Ark's operational system in 3 dimensions, and careful study of that map reveals things about how the system works that cannot be determined from external observation alone. The material traces of past human activity in Ark-controlled zones have a poignant quality in the lore, and the game leans into this rather than simply using ruined environments as neutral backdrop. Personal effects in abandoned structures, the remains of ongoing projects that were interrupted by the invasion, evidence of communities that tried to continue functioning in the early days of the occupation, before the situation made that impossible. These traces are not just atmosphere, they are evidence of the human cost of the invasion in a form that is immediate and personal rather than statistical. A single interrupted meal in an abandoned kitchen communicates something about what happened to the people who lived there that a description of casualties cannot. The Ark installations that have been operating for the longest time show a kind of evolution in their physical character that is informative about how Ark's program has developed. Early Ark structures in the most established zones have a rawness that later structures lack, a quality of improvisation that is, paradoxically, the Ark equivalent of improvisation, of initial infrastructure established with what was immediately available before more refined materials and methods became accessible through the extraction and processing operations. The evolution from early to later Ark structures in a given zone tracks the development of that zone's integration into Ark's operational system, and reading that evolution gives you a sense of Ark's progress toward its objectives that simple observation of current activity does not. The lore embedded in the game's environmental detail also includes the traces of past conflicts, of engagements between human forces and Ark that took place in the areas where raiders now operate. The damage patterns in structures, the equipment left behind by both sides, the improvised fortifications, and the breached positions. All of this tells stories about what happened in specific places that supplement the more general historical account in the explicit lore. Some of these traces point towards significant events, large operations, major confrontations that are not described in detail in the explicit lore, but whose scale is visible in the physical evidence. The game world is full of these undescribed past events, and their presence in the environment gives the history a depth that explicit description could not create. One of the most interesting categories of environmental lore is the evidence of Ark operational failures, the places where Ark systems appear to have malfunctioned, where the expected uniform efficiency of Ark activity was disrupted by something. These sites are rare, and they are typically difficult to access, but the lore points toward their existence in several contexts. An Ark processing facility where something went wrong, a unit graveyard where machines accumulated in a way that suggests a systemic failure rather than simple combat loss. Zones where Ark's environmental modification produced results that appear inconsistent with the surrounding pattern of modification. These anomalies are interesting not just as tactical opportunities, but as evidence that Ark's system, for all its sophistication, is not perfect. It makes errors. It encounters problems it has not encountered before. The nature of those errors and problems might, if understood, reveal something important about Ark's vulnerabilities. The documents and records that survive in the game world, the written and electronic records of pre-invasion human activity that were not destroyed when Ark moved through an area, are another form of environmental lore that raiders can access and that the game's broader narrative draws on. These records cover the full range of pre-invasion human life: commercial records, personal correspondence, official documents, scientific research. Their relevance to understanding Ark is indirect, but real. They describe the world as it was before the invasion, which gives you a baseline against which to measure what Ark's presence has changed. They also sometimes contain observations or analyses from the period immediately after the invasion, from people who were trying to understand what was happening in real time, and those observations, made from the inside of the event, have a quality that retrospective analysis cannot replicate. The physical evidence of how Ark units behave in specific environments provides tactical lore that complements the strategic lore of the explicit game materials. The patterns of Ark patrol activity visible in the marks on the ground, in the wear on structures that units pass through repeatedly, in the positioning of Ark sensor equipment in relation to terrain features, all of this reflects the operational logic of Ark unit deployment in ways that can be read and used by raiders who know what to look for. The landscape is, in this sense, a record of Ark's behavior over time, and reading that record is a skill that separates effective raiders from those who rely purely on current observation. The most historically significant sites in Ark-controlled territory, the places where the invasion's history is most densely written into the physical environment, are also the most dangerous to access. The zones of heaviest Ark presence correspond not coincidentally, to the zones of greatest historical significance in terms of understanding what happened during the invasion and what ARC is currently doing in its most important operations. This creates a specific tension in the Raider enterprise between the intelligence value of penetrating deeply into ARC territory and the survival cost of doing so. The people who have gone deepest and come back have the most valuable information. The cost of going that deep is real. The law does not pretend the tension is easily resolved. Chapter 10. The factions caught in the crossfire. The human world that exists alongside and within the ARC invasion is not a unified thing. The factions that have survived the invasion, the organizations and communities and power structures that have coalesced in the post-invasion world reflect the full diversity of how human beings respond to catastrophic change. Some are militarized, some are corporate, some are community-based, some are built around specific ideological positions about how to respond to ARC. None of them have found the complete answer. All of them are doing something that matters for the survival of the people they represent. And understanding the factions is understanding the human landscape that raiders operate within. The military organizations that survived the invasion and adapted to the post-invasion strategic environment are in most cases significantly different from their pre-invasion counterparts. The military doctrine that existed before ARC was designed for a different kind of conflict, and the organizations that held rigidly to that doctrine in the early years of the invasion performed worse than those that were willing to throw out established models and develop new approaches. The military factions that are present and significant in the game world have, in most cases, gone through a process of painful transformation that selected for adaptability and practical competence over adherence to traditional military structure. The result is forces that are more flexible and more creative than the military institutions of the pre-invasion world, but also more resource-constrained and operating under greater uncertainty about the long-term strategic situation. The corporate entities that have survived the invasion occupy a uniquely complex position in the post-invasion world, one that the law treats with the kind of moral ambiguity that the subject deserves. Corporations exist to generate returns for their stakeholders, and that fundamental objective does not disappear because an alien invasion happened. The post-invasion world has created new economic opportunities alongside the devastation, and some corporate actors have pursued those opportunities in ways that are broadly beneficial to human welfare and in ways that are not. The law does not universally condemn the corporate presence in the post-invasion world, but it also does not let the corporations off the hook for the ways in which their pursuit of institutional interests has complicated or worked against the collective human response to ARC. The community-based organizations that have emerged in the post-invasion world are the most diverse category and in some ways the most interesting. They range from formal city administrations managing surviving urban centers to informal networks of mutual aid in areas where formal institutions have collapsed, to semi-organized communities of displaced people building something new in the margins between ARC territory and human-controlled areas. The diversity of these communities, their different approaches to the problems of survival and governance, and the relationship to ARC, reflects the actual diversity of human social creativity under pressure. The law's accounts of these communities are some of its most humanly resonant material because they are about people solving problems rather than about systems in conflict. The raider organizations themselves are a faction type that the law treats with the most nuance because raiders occupy an interesting position relative to all the other factions. They operate in ARC territory, which gives them a knowledge and capability that no other faction has in the same way. They are economically important to the surviving communities that depend on what they bring back, but their organizational structure and values are distinct from both the military and corporate factions, and their relationship to the broader human interest is complicated by the fact that individual raider operations are driven by a combination of community obligation, personal survival, and the specific economic relationships of the post-invasion world. The best raiders are not purely selfish, but they are also not purely altruistic. They are human beings in a difficult situation, making practical choices, and the law honors the complexity of that rather than simplifying it. The relationships between the different human factions are characterized by a mixture of cooperation and competition that the law is honest about. The invasion created a common threat, But common threats do not automatically create unified responses. The factions have different interests, different time horizons, different assessments of what the most important priorities are. They cooperate when their interests align, and they compete when those interests diverge. And the post-invasion world has created new kinds of interest divergences alongside new kinds of common ground. The picture that emerges is of a human political landscape that is genuinely complicated, in which no single faction has all the right answers, and in which the collective human response is, as a result of this fragmentation, less than the sum of its parts. The specific points of tension between factions are some of the most interesting details in the law. The tension between military and corporate interests over the use of captured ARC technology is one example. The tension between community-based organizations that prioritize local survival and larger organizations that prioritize longer-term strategic positioning is another. The tension within the raider community between those who operate primarily in the service of specific communities and those who are more purely mercenary is a third. These tensions are not incidental to the story of the post-invasion world. They are part of the structure of the human response, and they shape what is and is not possible in terms of collective action against ARC. The ideological dimensions of the factional landscape are present in the law, but not dominant. There are factions whose approach to ARC is shaped by specific beliefs about what ARC is and what it ultimately wants, and those beliefs lead to different prescriptions for how to respond. Some believe that ARC can ultimately be understood and negotiated with. Some believe that total resistance is the only viable option. Some believe that accommodation, finding ways to exist alongside ARC's operations without direct confrontation, is the most realistic path for human survival. The law does not adjudicate between these positions, which is the right choice for a story that is genuinely uncertain about the answers to the questions these positions are responding to. Different characters hold different positions honestly, and the positions are presented with enough depth that you can understand why each one makes sense given the person holding it. The question of what the factions know about ARC that is not widely shared is one that the law raises repeatedly in the context of faction politics. Different factions have different information about ARC based on their operational positions and histories. The military factions have their tactical intelligence. The corporate factions have the results of their technology research programs. The raider communities have the accumulated observational knowledge of years of operations in ARC territory. This information is not fully shared between factions, for reasons ranging from institutional secrecy to simple logistical difficulty. The fragmentation of human knowledge about ARC is, in some ways, as significant a limitation on the human response as the fragmentation of military capability. If everything that is known about ARC were pooled and analyzed collectively, the picture might be meaningfully different from what any individual faction can see with its partial information. The question of whether that pooling will ever happen and what it might reveal if it did is one of the open questions at the horizon of the law. The role that the various factions play in enabling and constraining raider operations is one of the most practically relevant aspects of the factional landscape for the game's central activity. Raiders depend on faction relationships for equipment, for intelligence, for safe haven, for medical support, and for the economic relationships that make their operations financially sustainable. The factions, in turn, depend on raiders for materials, for intelligence, and in some cases for specific operational tasks that the faction's own capabilities cannot accomplish. This mutual dependence creates a web of relationships and obligations that shapes every individual raider's situation. Who you work with and on what terms determines a great deal about what is possible and what is not. And the factional landscape is the context within which all of that negotiation happens. The future of the factional landscape is, by the law's reckoning, uncertain in ways that go beyond the obvious uncertainty about the outcome of the conflict with ARC. The factions are not stable entities. They are organizations of human beings under extreme stress, and under extreme stress, human organizations change. Some will grow stronger, some will fracture, some will be destroyed by ARC activity or by conflict with each other. The political landscape of the post-invasion world is in motion, and the direction of that motion is not predetermined. What the factions become, how their relationships evolve, whether the human political situation develops toward more effective collective action or toward greater fragmentation, is genuinely open. And that openness is part of what makes the world of Ark Raiders feel alive rather than static. Chapter 11: The Geography of Fear. The territories that Ark controls are not all the same. The differences between them, the variations in how deeply established Ark's presence is, how heavily the environment has been modified, how significant the extraction and processing operations are, how dense the Ark military presence is. All of these variations create a geography of Ark-controlled space that is not uniform. Understanding that geography is understanding the tactical and strategic landscape within which raiders operate, and the lore develops it in sufficient detail to give the game world a genuine sense of spatial differentiation, rather than a uniform hostile environment. The outermost zones of Ark-controlled territory, the areas where Ark's presence is lightest and most recent, have a character that reflects their status as contested margins. Ark activity is present, but not dominant. The environmental transformation has begun, but has not progressed far. Ark units are encountered, but not in the densities of more established zones. Human activity, both raider operations and the remnants of communities that have not fully abandoned the area, is still possible without constant direct confrontation with Ark. These outer zones are where the most recent displacement of human population has occurred, and where the evidence of recent human habitation is most vivid and most poignant. The community that was here 6 months ago might still be recognizable in the form of its abandoned structures. As you move deeper into Ark-controlled territory, the character of the environment changes in consistent ways that the lore documents through the accounts of those who have made the journey. The environmental transformation intensifies, the electromagnetic interference thickens, the density of Ark units increases, the structures that Ark has built become more elaborate and more deeply integrated into the landscape. The signs of pre-invasion human activity become more weathered, more absorbed into the Ark-modified environment, more remote. The psychological effect of moving deeper into established Ark territory is described consistently across multiple accounts in the lore as a kind of increasing alienation, not just from safety, but from familiarity. The world in the deep zones does not feel like Earth in a way that the outer zones still do. The core zones of Ark's most established operational areas are described in the lore with a level of care that reflects their narrative importance. These are the places where Ark has been operating longest, where the extraction and processing operations are most mature, where the environmental transformation is most complete, and where the Ark military presence is most concentrated. They are also the places that human intelligence knows the least about, because the combination of environmental conditions and Ark defensive density makes sustained human observation almost impossible. What is known about the core zones comes from occasional raider penetrations, from remote sensing with limited capability, and from inference based on what has been observed flowing out of those zones. The picture that emerges from those sources is of a place that has been fundamentally transformed from anything recognizable as Earth. The specific character of the electromagnetic environment in deep Ark territory is something the lore develops as both a practical challenge and an atmospheric quality. The interference affects communication systems, navigation equipment, and many of the weapons and tools that raiders rely on. Moving through deep Ark territory requires preparation for equipment degradation that does not occur in the outer zones. Experienced raiders who have operated in these conditions have developed techniques and equipment modifications that help manage the interference, but the fundamental challenge cannot be entirely eliminated. The electromagnetic environment in core Ark zones is part of Ark's operational architecture, maintained actively as part of its processing operations, and it cannot be navigated around. It can only be navigated through with the right preparation and the right equipment. The water in Ark-adjacent zones has been documented in the lore as chemically altered in ways that make it unsuitable for human consumption without treatment. This is one of the most practically significant environmental effects of Ark's presence for both the populations that live near Ark-controlled territory and the raiders who operate within it. Water management is a major practical challenge in the post-invasion world, and the complexity of that challenge is greater in the areas closest to the heaviest Ark presence. The lore points toward this not as a detail of game mechanics, but as a dimension of the human cost of the occupation, of the ways in which Ark's operations create cascading effects on human life that extend well beyond the direct effects of combat. The seasonal variation in Ark activity is something that the law touches on in ways that suggest the machines are responsive to environmental conditions, rather than operating independently of them. Ark activity patterns change with seasons in ways that are consistent across multiple years of observation. The activity increases in some seasons and decreases in others, in ways that do not correspond to military logic, but do correspond to the availability of specific materials or the optimal conditions for specific processing operations. This seasonal responsiveness is another indicator of the primacy of extraction and processing in Ark's operational priorities, of the fact that the machines are fundamentally oriented toward material operations rather than combat operations, and that combat is what they do when their material operations are interfered with. The topography of Ark-controlled zones has been modified by Ark activity in ways that make navigation challenging even for raiders with pre-invasion geographic knowledge. Roads have been blocked or rerouted. Natural landforms have been altered to serve Ark operational needs. New structures have been built that create obstacles and channels for movement. The landscape inside established Ark territory is not the landscape that existed before the invasion, and the maps that were made before the invasion are unreliable in ways that can be fatal for those who trust them too completely. The raiders who operate most effectively in Ark territory maintain their own records of current conditions, updated from recent experience, and share that information within their networks. Current, ground-truthed geographic knowledge of Ark territory is one of the most practically valuable forms of intelligence in the post-invasion world. The light environment of deep Ark territory has a quality that the law captures through the observations of those who have been there. Ark's operational infrastructure emits light in wavelengths and patterns that differ from natural and human light sources. The cumulative effect of Ark's electromagnetic and optical signatures creates a distinctive atmospheric quality in zones of heavy Ark presence, particularly at night, that is described consistently as wrong, not simply artificial, which pre-invasion human cities were also artificial, but alien in a way that does not correspond to any category of light that existed before the invasion. The visual environment of Ark territory is part of the sensory alienation of moving through those spaces, and the law uses it to reinforce the sense of genuinely unfamiliar territory without relying on explicit description of things that are simply strange-looking. The routes that raiders use to penetrate Ark-controlled zones are studied and restudied by both the raiders and by Ark. The machines observe where human intrusions occur, and they modify their defensive architecture accordingly. Raiders observe how Ark's defenses change and modify their routes accordingly. This mutual adaptation creates a continuously evolving tactical landscape in which fixed information about how to get into Ark territory has a shelf life measured in weeks or months rather than years. The knowledge that is most valuable is not the knowledge of what worked 3 months ago, but the knowledge of what the current state of Ark's defenses is in a specific zone. And that knowledge requires recent, direct observation. The economy of ground intelligence in Ark territory is driven by this perishability, by the fact that what you know decays in value quickly and must be continuously refreshed. The enduring quality of the most deeply established Ark zones is one of the most unsettling aspects of the occupation's geography. These are places that have been under Ark control for years, that have been so thoroughly transformed that the pre-invasion character of the place has been almost entirely replaced. They are not ruins. Ruins suggest destruction. These are places that have been rebuilt according to a different logic, that have been made into something else. The difference between a ruined city and a city that has been repurposed is significant. A ruin will eventually be reclaimed, if not by humans, then by nature. A repurposed city has been absorbed into a new system and will only become available again if that system withdraws or is destroyed. The deepest Ark zones feel, to the law's accounts of the people who have seen them, more like the latter than the former, not destroyed, converted, and the conversion, the transformation of these pieces of earth into something that serves Ark's purposes, is perhaps the most concrete expression of what Ark's power actually means for the planet it has occupied. Chapter 12. The Things No One Has Fully Explained. Every complex law has its mysteries, the things that the narrative raises but does not answer, that are planted as questions and allowed to grow through accumulated suggestion rather than resolved through explicit revelation. Arkwraider's law is unusually rich in this category, and the mysteries it maintains are not gaps or oversights. They are deliberate. They serve the larger narrative function of keeping the world's central questions open, of pointing toward a reality that is larger than what can be seen and understood from the human vantage point inside the conflict. The unsolved mysteries of Arkwraider's law are where the deepest meaning of the story lives, and this chapter is about sitting with those mysteries honestly rather than pretending they have been resolved. The origin of Ark is the foundational mystery. Where did the machines come from? Who or what made them? What purpose did whatever made them have in mind when it sent them to Earth? The law addresses the question of origin obliquely, through details that point toward a large and old presence rather than a recently emerged technological power. The sophistication of Ark's technology, the scale of its operational capacity, the apparent foreknowledge of Earth's resources that its operations reflect. All of these point towards something that has been doing what it does for a very long time across more contexts than Earth alone. Ark is not a newcomer in whatever portion of space it comes from. It is something that has been building and operating for a period that dwarfs human civilization. What created it and why is not answered. And the answer, if there is one, is buried somewhere in a backstory that the law has not yet fully illuminated. The question of Ark's ultimate objective on Earth is related to, but distinct from the question of what it is collecting. The objective is the end point, the state of completion that the collection is working toward. What does Earth look like when Ark has finished what it came to do? The law provides enough material to construct a partial answer. The extraction operations have specific targets. The environmental modifications serve specific purposes. The infrastructure that Ark has built serves the extraction and processing operations. But the question of what all of this is for, what the collected materials will ultimately be used to build or power or enable, is not answered. The end point of Ark's program on Earth is one of the things that the law holds furthest from resolution, and the holding of it is deliberate. The nature of the connection between Ark units on Earth and Ark presence beyond Earth is another mystery that the law maintains carefully. The units on the ground are not the whole of Ark. They are part of something larger. But the nature of that larger something, how it relates to what is on the ground, whether it is directing operations on Earth or simply providing the framework within which Earth operations are conducted, whether the decision to come to Earth was made somewhere beyond Earth, and what the ongoing relationship is between the Earth operation and whatever is beyond it, these questions are all open. The law hints at the existence of a connection, at the fact that what is on Earth is not independent of what is elsewhere, but it does not describe the connection in any direct way. The history of Earth before the invasion, specifically the question of whether Ark had any contact with or awareness of Earth before the arrival, is a mystery that certain law fragments point toward without resolving. The precision of Ark's initial operations, the apparent foreknowledge of Earth's resource profile, the efficiency with which Ark moved to claim specific materials in specific locations, all suggest prior knowledge. How that knowledge was acquired, whether Ark conducted reconnaissance before the arrival that humans were aware of or not, whether the knowledge reflects something older and stranger about Ark's relationship to Earth, is not made clear. The possibility that Ark's relationship to Earth predates the invasion in ways that have not yet been understood is one of the law's more intriguing open threads. The question of whether there are other entities, other intelligences, other powers, either organic or machine, that exist in the same space as Ark and that have their own relationships with it or with Earth, is raised by certain elements of the law in ways that are too subtle to be accidental. Ark is the dominant presence in the game world, but the universe the game exists in is presumably large enough to contain more than one significant power. Whether there are other entities with interests in what Ark is doing or in what Earth has to offer, whether the conflict on Earth is observed or noted by parties not currently visible in the story, is genuinely unknown. The law maintains this as an open question in ways that suggest it is intended to be developed, rather than simply left unanswered. The question of Ark's experience of the conflict, if experience is even the right word, what the invasion means from Ark's side, whether the existence of human resistance is something that registers in Ark's operational calculations as more than a variable, Whether there is anything about the human world that Ark has in any sense responded to beyond tactical adaptation is a question that the law raises with the deepest ambiguity. The machines that are executing the program on Earth are executing it. They have not, the law suggests, departed from the program in response to anything they have encountered. But whether the program itself was influenced by prior contact with life, whether whatever made Ark had its own relationship to the concept of a living world, whether the decision to treat Earth's inhabitants as an obstacle rather than a subject of interest reflects a settled policy or a default that could theoretically be otherwise, is completely unknown, and the completeness of that unknown is perhaps the most important mystery of all. Chapter 13: Survival in a World That Does Not Care If You Live. The daily reality of survival in the post-invasion world is the ground level of the Ark Raiders' story, the place where all of the strategic and historical and philosophical complexity of the larger narrative meets the immediate practical experience of people trying to stay alive. The law addresses this ground level with the same attention it gives to the larger questions, and what it reveals at that level is both more specific and in some ways more illuminating than the larger narrative alone. How people survive in a world where Ark is a constant presence is inseparable from who those people are and what the post-invasion world has made them. The basic requirements of survival in the contested zones are more difficult to meet than in the pre-invasion world, not universally and not catastrophically everywhere, but consistently in ways that shape daily life at every level. Food production is complicated by the environmental changes in Ark-adjacent zones and by the loss of agricultural land in areas now under Ark control. Water access requires management of contamination risks that were not present before the invasion. Medical care operates under chronic resource constraints, with equipment and medication that cannot be easily replaced. Security against both Ark activity and the human conflict that fills the margins of the Ark-human boundary is a constant consideration. The practical work of survival consumes a larger share of human time and energy than it did before the invasion, and that consumption is itself a form of cost that the law documents through the texture of daily life in the post-invasion world. The social structures that have developed around survival in the contested zones reflect the particular pressures of that environment. Trust is more valuable and more scarce than before the invasion, because the stakes of misplaced trust are higher. Community membership carries both obligations and entitlements that are more sharply defined than in the pre-invasion world, because the margins for free riding are smaller. The division of labor in surviving communities is shaped by the specific needs of the post-invasion situation in ways that differ from pre-invasion social organization. People who had skills that were peripheral before the invasion found those skills becoming central. People whose skills were based on the infrastructure of the pre-invasion world found themselves in the position of adapting to situations where that infrastructure no longer existed. The psychological dimensions of long-term survival in a world defined by the Ark invasion are something the law addresses through the character of the people it describes. The people who have survived multiple years in the contested zones carry the weight of that survival in specific ways. Hypervigilance, the constant monitoring of the environment for threats, is described as so deeply ingrained in experienced survivors that it persists even in safe environments. A specific kind of pragmatism, a willingness to make difficult decisions quickly without the luxury of extensive deliberation, is presented as a survival adaptation that has its costs in terms of the kinds of reflective engagement that define a certain quality of human life. The people shaped by the post-invasion environment are not damaged in a simple sense. They are adapted in ways that serve the environment and cost something in terms of the broader range of human experience. The relationship between raiders and the communities they serve is one of the more detailed areas of the law in terms of daily life and survival. The exchange relationship, materials for support, is the foundation, but the actual texture of the relationship is richer than a simple economic transaction. Raiders who return regularly to the same community develop relationships with the people there that carry obligations and affections beyond the exchange. Communities that have worked with specific raiders over time develop a form of trust and familiarity that shapes how they relate to the raider beyond the immediate economic transaction. The human dimension of the raider-community relationship is one of the places where the law's interest in the people of the post-invasion world is most fully expressed. The children who have grown up in the post-invasion world are a dimension of the law that is present but not overdeveloped, present enough to acknowledge, and not so developed as to become sentimental. The young people in the contested zones have a different relationship to ARC than the generation that experienced the invasion. For them, the machines are not an invasion. They are the environment, the coping strategies, the social practices, the attitudes toward risk and safety, and the future that these young people have developed are different from those of their elders, shaped by a world they have never known to be different. This generational distinction is one of the markers of how much time has passed since the arrival and how deeply the post-invasion world has settled into its own form, rather than remaining in a state of emergency relative to what came before. The specific practices that raiders have developed for staying alive in ARC territory are documented in the law with a level of practical detail that grounds the experience in concrete reality. Moving through ARC-controlled zones requires specific equipment management, specific movement techniques, specific approaches to communication and coordination. The methods are not magic. They are the result of experience and loss, of people learning through painful trial and error what works and what does not in the specific environment of ARC-held territory. The practical intelligence that experienced raiders carry is not abstract or theoretical. It is immediate and operational, the kind of knowledge that lives in the body as much as in the mind, that manifests as instinct in the field, because instinct is faster than deliberation and speed matters. The management of wounds and medical emergencies in the field is a dimension of survival that the law acknowledges through its treatment of raider equipment and the networks that support raider operations. Medical capability in the post-invasion world is unevenly distributed, and the raiders who operate farthest from established support infrastructure have to manage a higher degree of self-sufficiency in medical terms. The law points toward a culture of field medicine among experienced raiders that is pragmatic and effective within its limits, drawing on both pre-invasion medical knowledge and the improvised innovations developed in the post-invasion environment. The people who survive long careers as raiders in contested zones are people who have figured out how to manage their own injuries well enough to keep operating, which is a specific and demanding skill set. The economics of survival in the post-invasion world have created new forms of value and new forms of scarcity that shape social relations in ways that the law maps through its description of raider economies and community economies. The things that are most valuable in the post-invasion world are not always the things that were most valuable before: practical skills, specific technical knowledge, reliable working equipment, access to specific materials. These are the new forms of wealth in the contested zones. The social hierarchies that existed before the invasion have been partially reshuffled by this redistribution of value. People with skills that the post-invasion world needs, regardless of their pre-invasion social position, have found themselves more valued. People whose value in the pre-invasion world was based on access to systems that no longer exist have found themselves in a very different position. The hope that persists in the post-invasion world is one of the most important things the law documents about daily survival, and it is documented honestly, without sentimentality, in ways that reflect what hope looks like when it is not romantic, but practical. The people who have survived in the contested zones for years have not done so out of despair. They have a specific kind of hope, not the hope of a quick resolution, not the hope of returning to the world that existed before, but the hope of a viable future that is different from the past and from the present. What that future looks like, what specifically the people in the law are hoping toward, varies by character and community. But the orientation toward a possible future, the belief that there is something worth working toward beyond immediate survival, is present across the law in ways that give the post-invasion world a human texture that pure survival narratives often lack. Chapter 14. What the data suggests about ARC's power ceiling. Everything discussed so far gives you a picture of ARC's demonstrated power, the capability that has been observed and documented through years of conflict. But demonstrated power is not the same as total power, and one of the most important questions the law points toward without answering is the question of where ARC's power ceiling actually is. The machines have never operated at what appears to be their full capacity. They have responded to human resistance, with force calibrated to human resistance, rather than force calibrated to maximum effect. What they are capable of, if they were to apply their full operational capability against human opposition, rather than managing human resistance as one variable among many in a larger operational program, is a question that the law holds open and that the available evidence can only partially address. The clearest indicator that ARC's demonstrated power is not its maximum power, is the consistency of ARC's calibrated response to human opposition. Every engagement documented in the law shows ARC deploying what appears to be sufficient force to manage the human threat rather than overwhelming force designed to eliminate it decisively. This calibration could reflect resource conservation, a logical choice for a system that is managing multiple competing demands on its operational capacity. It could reflect strategic calculation, a decision that overwhelming force is not necessary and that the costs of deploying it exceed the benefits. It could reflect constraints on ARC's Earth-based operational capacity that limit the force it can bring to bear. Or it could reflect something about ARC's objectives on Earth that makes eliminating human resistance entirely undesirable, a possibility the law plants without developing. Each of these possible explanations implies a different kind of ceiling, and the law does not disambiguate between them. The installation-level weapons systems that ARC has embedded in its most established zones represent a significant step up in capability from the unit-level weapons that raiders typically encounter. The law describes these systems in ways that emphasize their ability to engage and defeat human military capability at a scale that goes beyond what individual units can achieve. The existence of these systems suggests that ARC has the capability to respond to organized human military action at a significantly higher level than anything that has been routinely encountered. But these systems have been used defensively to protect specific ARC installations against organized human attack rather than offensively. Whether ARC has an equivalent capability for offensive military action at scale, the ability to project force beyond its own operational zones in a way that would fundamentally change the strategic situation, is something the law suggests exists but does not document in use. The manufacturing capacity that ARC has established on Earth is a form of power whose ceiling is not clearly defined by any evidence in the law. The machines can build more machines. The capacity to do this is established. What the upper limit of that production capacity is, how many units ARC could field if it decided to expand its military presence significantly, is not knowable from the available law. The extraction and processing operations are clearly running at the scale required to support current operations and to produce output for other purposes. Whether the same operations could be scaled up to support a much larger military deployment, or whether doing so would require trade-offs with other objectives, is uncertain. The question of what ARC could call on from beyond Earth, if its Earth operations were significantly threatened, is perhaps the most consequential uncertainty in assessing ARC's power ceiling. If what is on Earth is, as the law suggests, a fraction of ARC's total capacity, then the power ceiling of ARC as encountered on Earth is bounded by what has been sent rather than by what exists. If the Earth operation were genuinely threatened in a way that warranted escalation, and if the law's suggestion of a larger ARC presence beyond Earth is accurate, then the response that could be deployed would be of a different order of magnitude than what has been seen. This is not a comfortable inference, but it is an honest one based on what the law points toward. The specific scenarios in which ARC's full capabilities might be brought to bear are discussed in the game world by human strategists who think about long-term scenarios, and the discussions in the law are not reassuring. The scenarios that might trigger a qualitative escalation of ARC's response include specific threats to core operational infrastructure, disruption of the extraction program at a scale that would affect its overall timeline, and the development by human forces of capabilities that ARC's current operational posture cannot manage effectively. Human strategists who think about these scenarios generally conclude that the best available strategy is not the one that maximizes damage to ARC in the short term, but the one that most effectively gathers information and builds capability while staying below the threshold of a response that would be qualitatively more severe than what has been encountered. The knowledge that ARC could probably do significantly more than it has done, that the constraint on what it has done is operational logic rather than capability limitation, is one of the most psychologically significant pieces of information in the post-invasion world. For the people who understand it, it creates a kind of permanent background anxiety that is distinct from the direct fear of specific ARC units in specific encounters. The direct fear is manageable. Experience and skill and good equipment can reduce it to something that experienced raiders can function with. The background anxiety, the awareness that you are operating within a space that an enormously powerful system has decided to allow, rather than a space you have secured through your own capability, is harder to manage and harder to talk about. The law acknowledges this psychological dimension through the way it describes the internal experience of long-term raiders who have thought carefully about their situation. The assessment of ARC's power ceiling is ultimately incomplete, because the evidence available is insufficient to determine it definitively. What can be said with reasonable confidence, based on the law, is that demonstrated power significantly understates total power. The machines have the resources, the production capacity, the organizational architecture, and possibly the off-world backup to be a great deal more forceful than they have chosen or been required to be. Human resistance has been significant enough to impose real operational costs on ARC's program without being significant enough to threaten that program fundamentally. The strategic space between imposing costs and threatening the program is the space where the conflict currently lives. And understanding that the machines have significant reserves of capacity that they have not deployed is essential to understanding the true nature of the power imbalance. The implication of all of this for the long-term outlook of the human characters in the law is sobering but not hopeless, which is a careful balance that the law maintains throughout. The situation is genuinely difficult, genuinely asymmetric, and genuinely uncertain in its long-term trajectory. The machines are powerful, more powerful than has been fully demonstrated, and the gap between human capability and ARC capability is real. But the machines are not invincible. They have operational constraints. They have vulnerabilities that human ingenuity has identified and exploited, imperfectly, but meaningfully. They have a program that is being executed on a specific timeline, and that timeline creates pressure that ARC cannot simply ignore. The question of whether human capability can develop fast enough, gather enough information, and find the right leverage point before ARC's program reaches whatever its endpoint is the question that drives the whole story forward. The answer to that question is not given. It is what the story is about. And the fact that it is genuinely uncertain, that the law does not promise a resolution that favors one side or the other, is what gives the Arc Raiders world its weight. This is a story about people in a genuinely difficult situation, doing genuinely difficult work, with genuinely uncertain outcomes. And that is more interesting, more respectful of the reader's intelligence, and more honest about how the world actually works, than a story where the resolution is predetermined and the struggle is only theatre. The power of ARC is real. The resistance to it is real. The outcome is open, and the open outcome is why you keep playing. Chapter 15. Signals from the edge of what is known. The outermost edge of the Arc Raiders lore is where the most interesting speculation lives, the point where documented evidence ends and inference begins, where the patterns that have been established in the earlier material point toward things that have not yet been confirmed. This is not guesswork. The law has been constructed with sufficient internal consistency that the edges of what is known have definite shapes, and those shapes point in specific directions. Sitting at that edge and looking in the direction it points is not the same as inventing things the law has not said. It is reading the structure of what has been established to see what else the structure implies. The most consistent signal from the edge of the law is that ARC's program on Earth has a phase structure, that what is happening now is not what happened at the beginning and is not what will happen in the future, that the machines are working through a sequence of objectives rather than doing a single thing indefinitely. The evidence for this is in the way ARC activity has changed over the years of the occupation, in the way certain operations have wound down, while others have intensified, in the appearance of new unit types and new infrastructure configurations that suggest shifts in operational priority. If the program has a phase structure, then there is a next phase, and what that next phase looks like is one of the most important questions the law raises at its edge. The relationship between the environmental transformation of Ark-occupied zones and Ark's broader program is a signal that points toward a specific kind of endpoint. The transformation is not random, it is directional. The chemical and physical properties of the most thoroughly transformed zones have moved in consistent directions over time, and the direction they are moving suggests a target state that is different from the initial state. Whether that target state is a final condition, the end of the transformation, or a necessary intermediate step towards something further is not clear, but the direction is clear enough to infer that the transformation is deliberate and goal-directed, and that the goal has a specific character that can be partially described, even if not fully understood. The signals that exist about what is beyond Earth in the Ark Raiders universe are among the most carefully constructed elements of the lore at its edges. They are present enough to establish that the Earth story is not the whole story, that there is a larger context within which the events on Earth take place. They are absent enough to keep that larger context genuinely unknown. The balance between present and absent in this area of the lore is precise, and the precision suggests deliberate authorial choice rather than incompleteness. The signals are there to point, not to describe. What they are pointing toward is a larger reality that the Earth story is one chapter of, and the nature of that larger reality is the horizon toward which the whole lore is oriented. The specific question of what happens when Ark finishes its program on Earth, whatever that looks like, is the question that the lore's edge points toward most insistently. The machines are not going to be here forever. The program is being executed toward a conclusion. What the conclusion involves for Earth, for the people on Earth, for whatever Ark is and whatever it is working toward, is the question that sits at the end of the lore and pulls you toward it. The Ark Raiders world is a world in motion, a world in the process of becoming something that it has not yet become, and the direction of that becoming is one of the deepest mysteries in a story full of mysteries. The signals from the edge of what is known are not answers, they are directions, and following them is what the story asks of you. The final signal worth noting is the simplest and perhaps the most important. The machines came to Earth because Earth had something they needed. They have been taking it for years. The program is advancing, and the people who live on Earth, who are trying to survive and understand and resist, are in a race with a timeline they do not know. That race is the story. The firepower of Ark is real and enormous, and not fully displayed. The stakes are the planet and the civilization that calls it home. The outcome is not written, and the raiders who drop into the occupied zones every day, who do the difficult, dangerous, necessary work of going where the machines are and coming back with what the surviving world needs, are the people at the sharpest point of the most important story being told in this world right now. That is the story. That is what Ark's power really means, and it is not over. Chapter 16, The Machines That Learn While You Sleep. One of the most unsettling qualities of Ark as an adversary, and one that the lore develops through accumulated detail rather than direct statement, is the continuous nature of its learning process. Human learning happens in discrete moments. You have an experience, you reflect on it, you update your understanding, and that updated understanding informs future behavior. There is a rhythm to it, a cycle of action and reflection, that means human adaptation has a pace determined by the time it takes to process experience into understanding. Ark does not have that rhythm. The machines update continuously, in real time, without the gap between experience and adaptation that characterizes human learning. By the time a raider team has returned to base and debriefed about what they encountered in the field, Ark has already processed the encounter and updated its operational parameters accordingly. The learning happened while the humans were still in the field. This asymmetry in the pace of learning is one of the most consequential differences between Ark and the human forces that oppose it, and it is one that the lore returns to repeatedly through the accounts of experienced raiders who have felt its effects. The tactic that worked spectacularly 3 weeks ago is significantly less effective today, not because the humans have become less skilled, but because Ark has incorporated the tactic into its threat model and developed countermeasures. The countermeasures are not developed by a committee that meets and deliberates and issues new doctrine. They emerge from the system's continuous update process, without any explicit decision being made. The change happens, and the humans who encounter it discover through experience rather than intelligence that something has shifted. The specific mechanisms through which ARC units gather and process the information that drives this continuous learning are themselves interesting and not fully understood by the human characters in the lore. Every ARC unit in the field is a sensor as well as a combatant, and the data it gathers is not just about immediate tactical concerns.